Chapter 641, Notice. Nathan closed the system panel and let out a satisfied breath. He'd just checked the gains from raising his spiritual attribute and mapped out his future training goals. Now that he'd hit his milestone, advancing the Sharingan's evolution gauge from 30,000 to 50,000, there was no point in continuing the reflection of the heart technique beyond what he'd already done. His chakra reserves were still well above their lowest ebb, but Nathan didn't want to waste time resting. Today's final task on his agenda was to hone the multiple shadow clone technique. Focusing his will, he drew in a deep lungful of air and released it slowly, unleashing a pulse of chakra. Shadows flickered through the forest, each one a potential duplicate of himself. Nathan stepped forward, and nearly at once, a dozen phantoms mirrored his motions. He punched, and so did they. He leapt, and they followed suit. As he worked through each basic formation and each advanced variation, his mastery of the technique rose in leaps and bounds. Time dissolved around him. The wind whispered through the leaves as Nathan's clones shimmered in and out of existence, their numbers expanding and contracting in perfect rhythm with his chakra flow. With every clone he created and dispelled, his understanding deepened, learning efficiency, stability, and the subtler arts of chakra distribution. At last, satisfied that he'd met his daily quota of repetitions, Nathan allowed the final dozen clones to vanish. He stood alone in the quiet forest, his breathing steady, a small smile playing on his lips. Today's practice was complete, for now. Nathan had been honing this technique for an hour and a half now. He closed his eyes and ran through the day's training regimen in his head. Satisfied that he'd completed each step, he opened his eyes, inhaled deeply, then exhaled in a slow, controlled stream. He rose from the forest floor, muscles protesting in protest, and gave himself a thorough stretch. After a few moments, he begrudgingly crawled over to the dying campfire and stamped it out. Gathering his remaining energy, he formed a hand seal and activated wind style, wind wings, immediately followed by chakra feather garb. In an emerald blur, he took to the air, heading straight for Shaha City. Nathan descended silently behind the city walls, slipped into his quarters, and collapsed onto his futon. He didn't speak another word before drifting into a deep, dreamless sleep. Morning came too soon. Nathan woke with the dawn, splashed water on his face, then made his way to the cafeteria. After a quick breakfast, he planned to send out a shadow clone to continue the previous day's practice while he attended to other duties. But just as he pushed back his chair, a voice stopped him. "Jonin Nathan, please wait a moment." Nathan turned to find a Chunin from Konohagakure standing in the corridor, bowing politely. Nathan recognized the messenger the moment he appeared, one of Captain Shi Zhenhong's Chunin. He studied the young ninja for a heartbeat, then asked, "What is it?" The Chunin bowed crisply. "Jonin Nathan, Captain Shi requests your presence at headquarters immediately." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "The command center?" "Yes, sir." With that, the Chunin turned and hurried away. Nathan watched him go, already piecing together why he'd been summoned. He strode off toward the command center without another word. A few minutes later, Nathan slipped into the conference room. Captain Shi stood at the head of a long table, maps and reports spread before him. As Shi began to outline the next steps for their return to the village, Nathan's mind settled. There was no crisis, only the routine briefing every senior ninja received before heading home. By the village's order, they would remain on the front lines a little longer, ensuring no unexpected developments arose before their final withdrawal. 2 weeks had passed since the war's end, and the front lines had fallen silent. With order restored, Konoha's leadership decided it no longer needed so many shinobi stationed beyond the village walls. Under these new orders, Nathan was to lead 100 returning soldiers, and the vital supplies they carried, back to Konoha within the week. Though hostilities had ceased, the peace remained fragile. Rumors of warmongers scheming in hidden corners raised the specter of renewed conflict, and powerful gangs that thrived during the fighting now threatened travelers along the roads. Even inside the Land of Fire, any contingent coming off the front required a Jonin-level escort. Nathan's mission was clear. Alongside 2 other seasoned Jonin, he would safeguard both comrades and cargo on the journey home, ensuring that a single misstep could not plunge the world back into war. Nathan checked his watch and realized it had been well over 2 years since he'd last set foot in Konoha. When the Chunin exams ended, he was still a green rookie. Now he'd climbed the ranks to become one of the village's top jonin. Reflecting on the past 24 months, he felt nothing but busy satisfaction. Real danger had been scarce. His hidden trump card always kept him one step ahead, so life had treated him well. At that moment, Commander Zhenhong cleared his throat in the command center at Shahe City. All right, everyone, here's our next assignment. Head down and prepare immediately. A chorus of "Yes, sir" rose as the ninjas filed out. Nathan lingered, eyes roaming the nearly empty room until he found a quiet corner. With a swift hand seal, he unleashed his shadow clone technique, summoning a perfect duplicate beside him. He gave the clone a curt nod. "I'm leaving. Stay here and oversee things until I'm back." The clone cracked a wry smile and bowed. Understood. Unfazed by the clone's casual salute, Nathan slipped away from the command center and vanished into the streets of Shahe City on his way to tackle the mission ahead. Nathan soared across the horizon, activating wind style, wind wings, and donning his chakra feather clothes to cover the distance in an instant. Before long, he arrived at the hidden clearing where he'd been training for days. As always, he released the guardian seal from the center of his brow and opened his Byakugan. Hovering above the ground, he circled the perimeter until he was certain no one watched. Satisfied, he descended. No sooner had Nathan's feet touched the earth than he unleashed the multiple shadow clone technique, spawning 6 identical replicas. He assigned each clone a detailed training regimen. Some would hone their taijutsu stances, others would refine elemental control, then sent them off to work. Alone at last, he turned his full attention inward, beginning with the palm immortal technique. With each strike and stance, Nathan felt the invisible shackles around his body loosening. The sensation was sharp and electrifying, proof that he was edging ever closer to his transformation's critical threshold. Once he'd put the palm immortal through its paces, he shifted to the reflection heart technique, now perfected at level 900. Every time he activated it, he could sense subtle awakenings deep within his Sharingan, as though his Mangekyo were stirring toward a new form. That blend of progress and potential fueled Nathan's determination. Even when the hours slipped by in solitary repetition, he found the work exhilarating. His muscles trembled, his chakra burned bright, and to him, nothing could feel more rewarding. Before he realized it, the sky had turned a deep indigo. Night had settled over the training grounds, but Nathan's spirit shone all the more brilliantly for it. Nathan spent the entire day immersed in cultivation before finally making his way back to Shaw City. After briefing himself on the day's developments around the city, he allowed himself a brief rest and fell asleep almost immediately. The following morning, he repeated the routine. He left a shadow clone behind to take care of his daily chores and dashed off to his training grounds. Over the next few days, Nathan's schedule remained unwavering. From before dawn until well after dusk, he was either deep in cultivation or en route to it. Every moment of his life pulsed with energy and purpose. Chapter 642, Chaos. A week had slipped by before anyone realized it. At dawn this morning, Nathan and 2 other Konoha Jonin gathered more than 100 shinobi and a dozen heavily laden carts to begin the journey home. Each wagon brimmed with strategic supplies left over from the Battle of Shai City, equipment and provisions too valuable to abandon. Hauling such a burden would slow their pace to a third of normal, stretching the trip to about 7 days. Still, not a single voice rose in complaint. On every face was a quiet relief. They had survived. This war had dragged on far too long, claiming too many lives. Everyone craved the peace they'd only glimpsed these last few days at the front. And yet, even in this uneasy calm, the veterans' instincts remained taut, a habit formed by more than 2 years of constant readiness. But soon they would see the familiar gates of Konoha, and with that, the freedom to finally relax. In that promise lay their joy. How could anyone be anything but glad? Creak, creak. The convoy's wooden wheels rattled through the quiet forest. Nathan sat atop the lead cart, watching the endless line of trees slip by, growing increasingly restless. It had been over an hour since they'd departed, and nothing, no ambush, no hidden jutsu, had broken the monotony. With his mind wandering, he realized he couldn't even focus on his training. He glanced at the two Konoha Jonin riding nearby. "I'm going to get a better view from above," he said. "You two keep an eye on the convoy." They both knew Nathan possessed a flying ninjutsu, and after a brief exchange, they nodded. Nathan hopped down, formed his hand seals, and activated Wind Escape, Wind Wings. Translucent, wind-woven wings unfurled from his back, lifting him effortlessly into the sky. From below, the other shinobi stared up at his form, envy flickering in their eyes. Whether in a past life or the one they lived now, humans were bound to the earth. Soaring through open air was a rare privilege. Within moments, Nathan was little more than a dot drifting against the canopy. He climbed steadily until the forest floor was a tapestry of dark green. Satisfied that no one could see him now, he leveled off, hovering silently among the treetops. The momentary solitude and sweeping view energized him. Finally, he could train undisturbed. Nathan raised his hands, crossing his fingers into the Ren seal, and channeled chakra into the shadow clone technique. In an instant, a dark cloud swirled at his feet, then dispersed to reveal a perfect copy of himself, hovering in midair. Nathan met the clone's gaze. "You stay with the convoy. I'm heading off to train." The clone nodded crisply. "Understood. I'll keep watch. If anything happens, I'll alert you immediately." "Good." Nathan offered a brief salute, then leapt into the sky and streaked away. As he flew, Nathan activated his telepathic link to the clone and calculated the convoy's speed. Consulting the mental map in his mind's eye, he pinpointed a spot exactly 100 kilometers ahead, right on the edge of his communication range. If he stationed himself there, he wouldn't have to uproot himself again. He could train in peace and still stay in constant contact with his duplicate. With his plan set, Nathan allowed the wind to carry him toward that distant mountaintop, ready to push his skills to the limit. Nathan formed the chakra seal in an instant. He activated his chakra feather cloak for protection, flexed his wings, and shot through the air at breakneck speed. Minutes later, he hovered above a dense forest ringed by two prominent peaks, one to the north, one to the south, labeled the Twin Mountains on his map. A broad, well-traveled road cut between them, serving as a major trade artery from the eastern reaches of the Fire Country to its central provinces. Today's convoy was set to pass that very way. Choosing the taller northern summit as his vantage point, Nathan landed without a sound. Rather than rushing below, he pressed his thumbs to the spot between his eyebrows, releasing the Guardian Sea. L. He adjusted his Konoha forehead protector, then activated his Byakugan. His vision turned a milky white as he surveyed every detail in a full 1-kilometer radius, anticipating, at first, that he'd find no one in such a remote area. Nathan hadn't expected to find signs of civilization on the smaller southern peak. As he flew overhead, he caught sight of clustered rooftops nestled against the mountainside, a humble cottage settlement. Curiosity piqued, he scanned the grounds and counted 30 to 40 figures below. None of them emitted chakra. They were ordinary people. He frowned. Nathan preferred solitude when he trained and didn't relish the idea of strangers wandering into his territory. After a moment's consideration, he eased his descent and landed lightly among the pines, concealed by shadow. Staying low, he crept closer to the settlement, determined to learn more without drawing attention. From his hidden vantage point, Nathan observed ragged clothes and weathered faces. Bandits, most likely. If they truly were marauders, he could handle them in an instant. Yet he hesitated. It was wiser to confirm their identities before acting. He narrowed his eyes, preparing a plan. Then, in a single silent motion, Nathan used his Sharingan to warp reality around him. He appeared directly behind one of the watchmen. The guard whirled in surprise, splitting the air with a startled cry. But before he could sound the alarm, Nathan had already ensnared his senses in an illusion, a flawless trick of the eye to keep the camp unaware of his presence. Within moments, the man's mind was ensnared in Nathan's illusion. As the false reality took shape, Nathan pieced together the truth behind these men. They weren't ordinary thieves. They were desperate refugees who had fled the war and struggled to survive in the mountains. At first, they eked out a living by hunting in the forest that bordered their makeshift camp. But when travelers and caravans began passing along the mountain's foot, the refugees discovered an easier and far more lucrative means of sustenance. Their initial pleas for help soon gave way to demands, and when that didn't yield enough, they resorted to outright looting. Hunger and fear had driven them from harmless begging to ruthless banditry. Nathan felt no pity for these men. Though their plight had begun with desperation, their choice to prey on innocent travelers marked them as criminals. He tightened his focus on the illusion, ready to punish those who had abandoned all scruples and become nothing more than mountain bandits. Nathan wiped ash from his blade and surveyed the silent mountain village. Dozens of enemy agents, inside and outside the settlement, had fallen to his fire escape ninjutsu. In moments, their bodies had turned to ash. Now, only empty huts and scorched earth remained. He drew a slow breath and asked himself how many more like them lurked across the land of fire. The answer came all too easily. Though the last 3 years of war had been fought mostly beyond the Land of Fire's borders, its people hadn't escaped unscathed. Infiltrating Shinobi paid little heed to civilians. Sometimes they slaughtered entire villages just to cover their tracks. Even when clashes erupted in the big cities, a single powerful jutsu could wipe out scores of innocents in an instant. Under that constant shadow of violence, how could ordinary folk live in peace? Even so, the 5 great nations fared better than the smaller territories torn apart by endless fighting. Yet of those displaced villagers and refugees, many saw no choice but to turn to banditry to survive. Nathan sheathed his blade. As long as such threats remained, neither villages nor cities could rest easy. Nathan could already sense that in the coming weeks, the village's missions to suppress bandits would spike dramatically. If Konoha hoped to preserve the Land of Fire's fragile peace, it would have to root out every threat left over from the war. Such thoughts flickered through his mind, but he shook his head to clear them and refocused on the task of Prasknor T-hand. Sealing his chakra once more, he formed the necessary hand signs and unleashed wind-style, wind wings, propelling himself skyward. As he soared, he activated his Byakugan and scanned the landscape below. Finding nothing amiss, he descended onto a rocky peak to the north and settled into his training. Chapter 643, The Great Slayer. The sun rose and set in the blink of an eye. By the time evening fell on the next day, Nathan was seated cross-legged atop North Peak of the Twin Mountains. His eyes were closed, his brow furrowed and relaxed rhythmically as slight veins throbbed at his temples. To any onlooker, he looked as though he were wrangling with some fierce inner storm. In fact, he was. Moments earlier, Nathan had dispelled his multiple shadow clone technique, recalling every clone that had been practicing around him. Now, he strove to absorb and integrate the flood of memories and experiences each clone had accumulated over the past hour. Such a rapid influx of data taxed his mind severely, but thanks to his strong mental fortitude, honed through countless trials over the past day, he could endure the strain. 15 minutes later, Nathan's eyes snapped open. A bright spark shone within them. He sat perfectly still, carefully sorting through the flashes of insight that had just revealed themselves in his consciousness. What he'd gleaned in that silent vigil promised to push his cultivation to an entirely new level. And with that thought, a faint, determined smile crossed his lips. Nathan pushed himself to his feet and strode toward the battered clearing where his shadow clone had trained. The patch of forest was eerily empty, its soil and scattered trees marred by countless lightning scars, testimony to the brutal practice it had witnessed. Here, over the past day, his clone had perfected the advanced technique Thunder Escape, Thunder Prison. After a week of relentless effort, Nathan's mastery had finally crystallized at level 7, 0/0. He stood at the center of the scarred ground, surveying the scene with his pale eyes. Satisfied that no one else was watching, he formed the hand seal almost instinctively. The air around him erupted in a deafening crackle as brilliant arcs of lightning danced along his limbs. Within moments, a shimmering downpour of electric currents cascaded from the sky, enveloping a radius of more than 10 meters. Every rock, every tree, every shadowed nook was struck, except for Nathan himself. He remained untouched, a calm island amid the storm of his own making, ready to probe the full extent of his newfound power. The lightning crackled around him as if it had a mind of its own, every bolt veering away from the 1-meter circle of safety around Nathan, leaving him unscathed. That unexpected reprieve let Nathan finally make out the full shape of the Thunder Prison. But according to the intel he'd gleaned from the Mist-Hidden Village's ninja, Xiaolei Yingren, this jutsu was supposed to be an all-out, indiscriminate assault. In truth, Thunder Release, Thunder Prison, rains down lightning with no concern for friend or foe. The only reason Nathan remained untouched was that the caster was carefully modulating the chakra flow, steering each bolt around him. Of course, that level of precision is a temporary luxury. The moment Xiaolei Yingren pushes this technique to its limit, even he won't be able to protect himself. Once the jutsu reaches full power, its strikes become uncontrollable. Anyone within range, ally or enemy, stands to be electrocuted. Moreover, the speed, density, and overall coverage of Thunder Prison depend entirely on the user's mastery of the release and their chakra control. To put it in perspective, for Xiaolei Yingren to match Nathan's current performance, his own Thunder Prison radius would barely exceed 10 meters. Beyond that, he simply doesn't have the finesse or the chakra reserves to maintain such pinpoint accuracy. Nathan knew that even now, the power and density of the lightning trapped inside his jutsu hadn't surpassed half of what he was capable of releasing, his absolute limit. Yet the ninjutsu crackling before him was still well within his capacity. Summoning all his focus, he flooded the technique with more chakra. Immediately, the boundary of lightning release. Thunder Prison began to swell outward, 30 meters, 35, 40, 45, and before long, it shattered the 50-meter mark. At the same time, the lightning within grew from a light drizzle into a full-fledged downpour. Blinding bolts stabbed through the gloom, completely filling Nathan's vision so that even his Sharingan couldn't pierce the storm. A relentless fizz of electricity battered his eardrums, obliterating every other sound. In that maelstrom, it was all he could do just to maintain the barrier. Channeling the lightning into a focused attack was out of the question. Indeed, this jutsu truly deserved its name, Thunder Prison. Under such an unending torrent, no one could hope to break free, not a genin, not even a jonin. Unless, enemies caught inside the Thunder Prison have only two choices: get out before it fully expands, or rely on some special countermeasure. Otherwise, they'll be incinerated by the unleashed lightning. Of course, only Nathan can push this jutsu to such extremes. Without the aid of a Sharingan and an expertise panel, no other shinobi could hope to match this level of control, and even now, he's far from his true limit. Nathan paused his hand seals, allowing the crackling energy around him to subside into a tense silence. He drew a deep breath, then raised his hands and wove the familiar cross seal in midair. Chakra Feather Cloak. A soft emerald glow blossomed around his frame, weaving a semi-solid barrier of feather-like chakra strands. No sooner had the cloak solidified than Nathan shifted into the next sequence. Fingers blurred through precise seals, and he invoked Lightning Release, Thunder Prison. With a thunderous clap, brilliant arcs of lightning shredded through the clearing. In the span of a heartbeat, it was as if the storm itself had descended. Dozens of searing bolts radiated outward in a 100-meter radius, battering the earth, snapping tree trunks like twigs, and igniting the very air with blinding brilliance. Even the 16:9 compendium and its associated forums acknowledge that there is no alternative rendition. This is the definitive execution of Thunder Prison. At this moment, shaping and containing raw lightning to this magnitude represented Nathan's current ceiling of power. After all, wind remains a poor conductor for electricity, and without exact control, even the greatest storm could rage out of hand. Wind release inherently suppresses thunder release, and Nathan's chakra feather robe is founded on manipulating wind nature chakra. When he first unlocked Thunder Release, Thunder Prison, his solution to its indiscriminate devastation was simple. Activate the feather robe first, then cast the Thunder Prison. That sequence lets him harness the jutsu's full destructive power without destroying himself, pushing the technique right up to his personal limit. A final, manic crackle of electricity rattled the air, then everything snapped into sudden silence. Nathan exhaled slowly and scanned the aftermath. Even though he'd steeled himself, he couldn't hide his shock. Every flower, every tree, the very soil and stones within the Thunder Prison's boundary lay charred and blackened, as if hammered by a relentless storm of lightning bolts. The devastation was absolute. a dark, smoking testament to the power he had just commanded. Nathan's pale blue chakra feather robe shuddered and then collapsed almost imperceptibly as his unstable chakra supply wavered. At its current defensive setting, the robe could absorb damage equivalent to 2 C-rank ninjutsu strikes every second, a barrage that would turn any ordinary shinobi into bloody tatters, even if they somehow survived. Though officially a B-level technique, Nathan's mastery had pushed its power well beyond that grade. Some speculated it had reached A-level strength. What made the chakra feather robe truly fearsome was its potential to grow stronger in lockstep with Nathan's chakra control and jutsu proficiency. The more skilled he became, the more resilient the robe would be. Its only drawback lay in the fact that channeling maximum chakra into defense left him vulnerable while resetting his guard, an instant a keen opponent could exploit. As a result, the lightning crackling within his thunder prison never unleashed its full fury all at once, giving even seasoned ninjas the sliver of time they needed to react. Anyone who reacts swiftly and knows the proper countermeasures still has a chance to escape. At the very least, they'll avoid the worst of the damage. Even so, there's no denying that this technique has become one of Nathan's most formidable weapons. Chapter 644, Awkward, Monthly Ticket Request. High atop the mountain peak, Nathan tested the Thunder Release Thunder Prison technique over and over, halting only when he felt he'd fully mastered both its destructive power and chakra consumption. After a brief rest, he sheathed his staff and drew the longsword at his side. It was time to move on to the next stage of training. Thunder Release, Thunder Sword. His plan called for redirecting the chakra he'd been dedicating to Thunder Prison toward perfecting this new sword technique. Why didn't he simply have his shadow clone do the practice? Nathan wanted first-hand experience of the chakra drain, so he could set realistic expectations for how quickly his proficiency might improve. In fact, he had already tried the Thunder Sword twice in the 2 days since learning it, and had achieved proficiency level 1, 100-200. Technically, he knew the energy cost, but theory and practice weren't always the same. He needed to confirm the exact toll it would take on his reserves. After all, he reminded himself, Thunder Release Thunder Sword merges elemental ninjutsu with swordsmanship. It's bound to be more taxing than a pure ninjutsu spell or a simple blade technique. He planted his feet, channeled chakra into the blade, and unleashed his first strike, this time with his full focus on measuring the feedback of energy spent. Each crackle of lightning on the edge of his sword felt like a note in a symphony, teaching him precisely what he needed to know. By the end of the session, Nathan would have the data and the confidence to push his Thunder Release skills even farther. Nathan's accelerated growth wasn't due solely to his sword skills. It also stemmed from his ever-deepening mastery of lightning chakra. At that point, he had already learned 2 advanced techniques, Lightning Release, Thunder Snake, and Lightning Release, Thunder Prison, though neither was fully perfected. The Snake technique, built on the fundamentals of Lightning Release, Thunder Strike, would give him only marginal gains once mastered. But the Prison Jutsu, a B-rank ninjutsu famed for its complexity, had pushed his understanding of lightning chakra to a whole new level when he finally perfected it. Naturally, Nathan was eager to put that newfound power to the test. As soon as the thought struck him, he closed his eyes, summoned his chakra, and ran through the precise hand seals of Lightning Release, Thunder Sword. At first, his practice resembled nothing more than ordinary sword training. Blade met air in a series of clean, controlled cuts, nothing spectacular. Then, in a single motion, Nathan swung his sword at the nearby tree. In an instant, raw electricity crackled along the blade, hissing through the air like a living thing. A blinding flash of blue-white light flared, and when it faded, the once pristine trunk bore a charred gash, proof that Lightning Release Thunder Sword was no ordinary technique. Nathan remained motionless, yet he could still make out the faint crackle of electricity dancing between the surrounding trees and the edge of his blade. This shimmering energy was the very essence of the Thunder Release, Lightning Sword technique. In battle, it did more than just flash brilliant arcs of lightning to bewilder opponents. It also sent jolts of current through their bodies, disrupting their nerves. Coupled with the sword's inherent deadliness, a single cut could leave any foe utterly incapacitated. Of course, wielding such power demanded perfect timing. Only the Sharingan's heightened perception could grant Nathan the split-second insight to strike at exactly the right moment. With that advantage, his mastery of the technique was destined to eclipse that of the young lightning prodigy, Lei Yingren. Nathan slipped the longsword back into its scabbard and paused to reflect. After a moment, he repositioned himself and began the drill again, over and over. Yet each repetition felt forced, as if he were going through the motions without truly connecting to the technique. Trusting his instincts, he finally halted his practice, sheathed his weapon, and stood silently, letting his mind clear. Nathan's fingertips drummed against the hilt of the long blade as his gaze drifted. Only when he registered the weapon in his hand did he jerk back to full awareness. Thunder Escape, Lightning Sword. The name alone told him it was a sword technique. In the Shinobi world, knives and swords often overlapped, yet subtle distinctions remained. Earlier, the moment that longsword touched his palm, he'd unleashed the full power of the Konoha-style sword technique, the Uchiha-style sword technique, and two other advanced forms without hesitation. His mastery of those styles was that high, he could seamlessly wield any ninja blade he chose. The only lower-tier art, the shadow sword technique, was entirely his own creation, perfectly tailored to his fighting style, so compatibility had never been an issue. But Thunder Escape, Lightning Sword, sat in a different category altogether. It was a second-hand technique he'd learned from another shinobi, and his proficiency was still far below the level he'd achieved with his other sword skills. Nathan knew that unless he practiced the sword technique exactly as intended, his movements would always feel awkward. Up to now, he'd been tinkering casually, but the moment he prepared for serious training, the flaws became glaring. Sure, with the help of his proficiency panel and the groundwork laid by other sword styles, he could adapt over time, but the efficiency penalty was unacceptable. He needed to wield a proper sword, raise his technique's mastery level, then return to his usual blade and transition smoothly. That way, neither time nor energy would be wasted. A relieved smile crossed his face. Good thing I kept it. He slipped the long sword back into its scabbard, reached into his ninja tool pouch, and withdrew a sealed scroll. Breaking the wax seal, he raised one hand in a simple hand sign and whispered, "Release." In an instant, a pile of assorted ninja tools, spoils from his past missions, shimmered into view at his feet, ready for whatever came next. Nathan surveyed the array of ninja tools laid out before him, each one top quality and part of his carefully crafted backup plan. He selected a short sword that gleamed with a cold, silvery light and poured a strand of chakra into the blade. Immediately, a crackle of electricity arced along its edge, demonstrating its superior chakra conductivity. He flexed his fingers around the hilt and swung the sword through a few practice cuts, nodding in satisfaction. This was a weapon forged by Master Lei Yingren himself, built to pair perfectly with Nathan's signature technique, the Thunder Release, Lightning Sword. It fit him like a missing puzzle piece. Satisfied, Nathan returned the short sword to his weapon scroll with a flick of his wrist and cast a sealing array to absorb the remaining tools back into storage. Now unencumbered, he turned his full attention to refining his Thunder Release technique. This time, everything clicked. The movements felt fluid, the surging electricity responding precisely to his will. He unleashed the lightning sword maneuver more than 10 times in a continuous flow before finally coming to a halt. Wiping a thin sheen of sweat from his brow, Nathan reviewed his chakra meter and logged the proficiency gains. By his calculations, expending 100 chakra points translated to roughly a 1-point increase in mastery. Nodding to himself, he tucked away his scroll, already planning his next training session. Nathan had invested a total of 89,000 chakra points into Thunder Release Lightning Prison, which translated into roughly 890 proficiency points per day. At that rate, he would reach level 5 in just 4 days, a breakthrough that would yield a qualitative leap in his skill. 16 days after that, he'd attain the perfected state of level 7. In other words, 20 days in total to master a B-rank ninjutsu. Not the fastest progression ever recorded, but hardly slow. Satisfied with his plan, Nathan formed the wrench and seal and unleashed the multi-shadow clone technique in a burst of shimmering chakra. When the smoke cleared, 6 identical Nathans stood before him. He handed his short sword to one clone and instructed him to drill lightning release, lightning sword. To each of the remaining 5, he assigned a different jutsu for practice. With his clones busily training under his supervision, Nathan returned to his original training spot. There, he resumed the palm immortal technique and the heart reflection technique, reinforcing his physical strength even as he continued to refine the next evolution of his Sharingan. Chapter 645. Return night had already fallen when Nathan finally wrapped up his training for the day. He settled into a meditative stance and activated his heart communication technique to contact the shadow clone accompanying his team. Over the past 2 days, they'd pushed ahead of him, and he needed to know whether they'd slipped beyond his reach, and if so, he'd have to relocate before they lost contact entirely. A moment later, the connection flickered alive. The team was still within range, but only just. Nathan couldn't afford to linger. He stood, methodically erased all traces of his presence over the last 48 hours, and unfurled a hand-drawn map. Scanning its contours, he pinpointed a remote valley several kilometers east, perfectly quiet, with ample space for his next training session. Having chosen his destination, he summoned Wind Style, Wind Wings, and slipped into his chakra feather garments. In one fluid motion, he burst into the air. At 300 meters per second, the journey took him barely 10 minutes, and he encountered no unexpected obstacles. The valley lay shrouded in moonlight, its only sound the whisper of a soft breeze. Nathan touched down in a copse of pines, found a sheltered nook, and fell into a deep sleep. When dawn broke, he woke hungry, swallowed a single ration pill to quell his appetite, and immediately resumed his rigorous practice. Another day, another step closer to mastery. The team pressed on, and before anyone realized it, 5 days had slipped away. Nathan had expected the return to the village would take a full week, but now, with only 1 more day's march ahead of them, it seemed they might make it back even sooner. Their pace had quickened almost instinctively. After all, most of these travelers had been away for 2 or 3 years. Nathan himself felt little urgency. He was a wanderer, a stranger with no home to rush back to, but for the others, whose families were longing for their return, each mile brought renewed excitement. So far, the journey had been mercifully uneventful. No ambushes, no serious injuries, no one had fallen. That kind of luck, Nathan knew, was rare and precious. Shaking off his thoughts, he stole a glance at the skill interface hovering before him. 1,000 proficiency points stood between him and the next level of his water style, the formidable Great Samadon Jutsu. A thrill ran through his veins as he imagined the power waiting just beyond his grasp. Nathan had originally calculated that, by the time he reached the village in 7 days, his A-rank ninjutsu would advance to the next level. But now, even if he poured every ounce of effort into training tomorrow, he'd still be about 500 to 600 proficiency points shy. It was frustrating. Levels 8 and 9 might sound only 1 step apart, but in reality, they represented a massive gulf. Once he mastered the Great Samadon Jutsu, the technique would undergo a true qualitative transformation, making it far more potent and practical in combat. He hadn't forgotten his real objective. The moment he returned to the village, he planned to find an opportunity to neutralize Danzo. To pull that off, he needed his strength to be at its absolute peak. Unfortunately, the transport convoy had been forced to hurry back to the village ahead of schedule, throwing his timeline off by a day or 2. Still, Nathan wasn't overly concerned. Rushing straight into Danzo's territory without careful preparation would be suicide. Gathering intelligence, watching for an opening, setting his plan in motion, all of that took time. A brief delay was no setback. It was simply another variable to accommodate on his path toward vengeance. Who knew? By the time he finally made his move, even the chakra feather robe, which still needed another half-month to advance, might already be upgraded. Then his chances would look a lot better. With that in mind, Nathan closed his status panel, found a quiet spot, and fell asleep almost instantly. 7 days later, at first light, Nathan and his team passed through Konoha's Grand Gate and stepped into the village. From the road ahead rose a wave of warm cheers. Villagers lined both sides of the street, waving and shouting their welcome as the convoy rolled past. Nathan surveyed the scene with a calm, unreadable expression. Quite lively, he thought. Of course, this greeting wasn't spontaneous. Though they could have slipped back in last night, the village had sent word for them to return this morning, to stage an official welcome. It was a simple morale boost. After all their hard work on the front lines, coming home to an empty village would have been a real letdown. Nathan couldn't help but wonder what was really going through their minds. Ninjas are human, after all, and no one is immune to the pull of honor, wealth, and fame. He'd noticed the convoy guards' smiles growing broader the moment they witnessed the demonstration. Shaking his head, he banished the thought and moved on. Once the formalities with the escort were complete, Nathan made his way up to the Hokage's tower to turn in his report. With the paperwork done, he set off for home. The Nine-Tails Rebellion hadn't yet erupted, and although the second Hokage, Senju Tobirama, had once relocated the Uchiha clan's lands, their territory still lay in the very heart of the village. It was a short journey back. Stepping through the door of his residence after such a long absence, Nathan felt a strange mixture of familiarity and disorientation. Familiar, because his predecessor had lived here for nearly 10 years, imprinting every corner of the place with indelible memories. Yet it also felt oddly new, as if time itself had shifted around him, waiting to reveal its next secret. Nathan couldn't shake the odd sensation settling in his chest. He'd only been back in Konoha for a few months since the time jump, barely enough time to sit the Chunin exams, yet it felt almost insignificant compared to the more than 2 years he'd spent on brutal battlefields. He let memories of that past life glide through his mind before setting his thoughts aside and spending the morning cleaning the house from top to bottom. Once he'd scrubbed every corner spotless, he headed upstairs to his room, planning a brief rest before heading out to train. The moment he flopped onto the futon, though, he found himself rooted in place. Despite surviving countless life-or-death situations, a quiet unease still throbbed beneath his skin, and the fatigue he'd stowed away over those years of conflict finally caught up with him. He'd often wondered why so many shinobi craved the safety and peace of this village. Now he knew. Konoha had always been his refuge, too. No wonder he felt a sudden slackness wash over him. It wasn't mere laziness, but a necessary recalibration of body and mind. After all, even the hardest training demanded its moments of rest. Nathan had been carving out rest periods after every grueling training session, yet no matter how long he paused, tension never fully left his body. Now, however, sheltered in this comparatively safe haven, he finally allowed himself to let go. Almost without thinking, he closed his eyes, and a few minutes later, soft snores drifted through the room. He'd only managed a few hours of sleep the previous night, and once his mind and muscles relaxed, exhaustion took over instantly. It was clear just how much fatigue he had stacked up. After all, he'd been ripped from a peaceful modern world and thrust straight into a brutal battlefield. Nathan was adaptable, but even he couldn't entirely mask the unease churning inside him. Otherwise, he wouldn't have driven himself so relentlessly to grow stronger. In a world this dangerous, only exceptional power could offer any real sense of security. And at the end of the day, he reminded himself he was still just a normal guy, one who needed every ounce of strength he could muster to survive. Chapter 646, Venturing Out time slipped by like a fleeting shadow. By the next evening, excitement still buzzed through Konoha and across the Uchiha clan lands. In a modest house on the outskirts, Nathan stirred. He blinked against the dim light and felt his mind swim with fog. Nearly 20 hours of sleep had passed, yet instead of refreshing him, it seemed to have unlocked every ounce of wariness he'd carried for the past 2 years. He lay on his back, weak, watching the sun dip below the horizon through a sliver of window. Minutes ticked by before a soft rumble in his stomach broke the silence. Nathan sat up, hand drifting absent-mindedly over his abdomen. Hunger pulled at him. After all, he hadn't eaten since he returned to the village that morning. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and reached for the ninja pouch of food pills at his belt. His hand froze midair. Nathan hesitated, heart rate picking up. Something was off. His pouch lay heavier than usual, and the seals on his pouches, tools, shuriken, explosive tags all seemed untouched. Yet just moments ago, he had used them. The realization hit him like a kunai to the chest. He shouldn't have all his supplies. A cold prick of dread ran down his spine. Did someone break in, or was his memory playing tricks on him? Nathan drew in a steadying breath, eyes narrowing as he steeled himself to investigate. He might be famished, fatigued, and disoriented, but he wasn't helpless. With cautious resolve, he rose from the bed, ready to uncover what had happened while he slept. Since we're back in the village, taking those military rations feels almost disrespectful. Nathan sniffed the air, catching a faint, mouth-watering aroma drifting in from outside. He couldn't resist. He needed a proper meal. "Time to eat," he muttered, swinging his legs off the bed and stretching until his joints popped. He stumbled into the washroom and splashed cold water on his face, the icy shock banishing the last traces of sleep. Refreshed, he returned to his room, grabbed his ninja satchel, and did a quick inventory check before cinching it around his waist. Konoha might be safe now, but 2 years on the battlefield had taught him to carry a full set of tools and extra supplies wherever he went. After carefully locking the door to the Uchiha compound, Nathan stepped out and headed straight for Konoha's busiest district, eager to track down something delicious. Nathan stood across from the Hokage building, where rows of shops and restaurants bustled with activity and street vendors hawked their wares along both sidewalks. He still hadn't settled on a place to eat, so he wandered the thoroughfare, sampling snacks from one stall after another. The vibrant scene reminded him of the food streets he'd loved in his past life. Now and then, a ninja strode past, some still clad in full gear with their tool pouches at the ready, eyes darting for potential threats even as they shopped. Others, unburdened by duty, promenaded in civilian clothing with their families, chatting and laughing. Small clusters of friends milled about too, celebrating something only they seemed to know. Everyone here carried a different story. Nathan let his gaze drift over them, savoring the atmosphere. Ahead of him, a barbecue joint sent mouth-watering smoke and the scent of sizzling meat wafting through the air. He licked his lips. He was determined to feast today, to eat his fill of skewered delights. But just as he stepped toward the restaurant's entrance, a sudden prickling unfolded at the back of his neck, an almost imperceptible awareness that he was being watched. Nathan hesitated, senses on high alert. Someone out there was keeping a close eye on him. Suddenly, Nathan's senses snapped to high alert, every trace of laziness and ease drained from him in an instant. He forced himself to remain outwardly calm as he stepped into the cafe, just like any other customer. After taking a seat, he ordered his meal and, while waiting, began to unobtrusively scan the room. Though the place was crowded with shinobi, no one paid him much attention. A few glanced his way, then looked away, and only a handful stared a little longer, drawn, it seemed, by the Uchiha crest emblazoned on his arm. None of them showed any overt hostility. If the threat wasn't inside these walls, it had to lie beyond them. Nathan stood and moved closer to the window, eyes flicking to the street. Who had met his gaze out there? A spy from a rival village? A bounty hunter after the black market reward? Anbu operatives? Or one of Danzo's men? His thoughts raced, but the stranger's look had been so brief that identifying him now was impossible, yet Nathan knew he couldn't ignore it. Although his attacker clearly intended harm, he hadn't stayed long enough for Nathan to pinpoint his exact location. Nathan's mind immediately turned to Danzo's operatives. In Konoha, without Danzo's sanction, no bounty hunter or spy would dare move so brazenly. Only the Black Ops Root ninjas answered to him. And Root held an intense grudge against Nathan, always searching for a chance to eliminate, or even worse, him. Keeping watch made perfect sense. Nathan had expected trouble sooner or later, but it was still irritating to have it on his very first day back. Any thought of taking a few days off evaporated, replaced by an insistent urgency. Whether his attacker was a seasoned ninja or just another pawn, Nathan resolved to confront Danzo's threat head-on. As the saying went, the night is long and full of dreams, and Nathan wasn't about to let his chance for retribution slip away. Over time, Nathan's ninjutsu had almost reached perfection. Beyond honing the Uchiha clan's secret techniques, the only thing that truly appealed to him were the priceless jutsu locked away in Konoha's sealed book. But that book wasn't open to just anyone. It required the Hokage's explicit permission. And given the lingering tensions between the village leadership and the Uchiha, even the well-meaning Hiruzen Sarutobi would be hard-pressed to grant Nathan unfettered access. At best, Sarutobi might allow him to learn a handful of minor techniques, hardly enough to satisfy Nathan's ambition. He needed a different solution. Danzo Shimura offered precisely that. Ever since quietly vying for the Hokage's mantle, Danzo had been building his covert force, the Root, by secretly copying jutsu from the sealed book under the guise of official training. If Nathan could earn Danzo's trust and tap into those illicit copies, on top of Root's own accumulated knowledge, he would unlock a treasure trove of advanced ninjutsu. Stealing the sealed book itself? That was virtually unthinkable. But pilfering Danzo's hidden cache of techniques? With the right leverage, it just might be possible. Although Naruto hadn't even graduated from the Ninja Academy, he somehow managed to swipe this book. But that was almost certainly Sarutobi Hiruzen's plan all along. The sealed volume is probably a decoy, and the only jutsu it really contains is the multi-shadow clone technique. Given Naruto's abysmal fundamentals, it makes perfect sense that Hiruzen, known far and wide as the professor of ninjutsu, would tailor a single simple skill to suit him. For anyone else to steal the genuine article, it would be like trying to scale the heavens. Nathan mulled this over, just as the waiter arrived with a portable grill and a tray of skewers. He lit the coals and watched the meat hiss as it met the flames, but his thoughts remained on the danger lurking outside. If the stranger he'd glimpsed really was one of Danzo's agents, there was no chance they'd simply let him walk away. He'd have to find a way to neutralize that threat, or risk having his training disrupted and his search for Danzo's trail compromised. However, if Nathan took action against them, he risked tipping off the enemy. He hesitated for a moment. Fortunately, he still had time to weigh his options. Chapter 647, Confirmation. An hour later, Nathan had eaten his fill and rested long enough for his meal to settle. He paid the bill, stepped out of the barbecue joint, and casually scanned the street. After just 2 steps, he froze, his eyes narrowing. He could feel someone watching him. The tail he'd sensed before was still there. Without a second thought, Nathan turned on his heel and headed for the open-air martial arts field at the edge of the village. Anyone who knew him, even in passing, would expect him to train there. It made the perfect bait. If his follower dared to keep up, Nathan would be ready. He intended to unmask the shadow and learn their identity, and if it turned out to be one of Danzo's operatives, he'd eliminate the threat on the spot. Alerting Danzo's network mattered less than forcing this confrontation on his own terms. No more waiting for the perfect opportunity. If he wanted to face Danzo, he'd draw them out himself. Nathan moved swiftly, confident this approach would resolve the matter. As he walked toward the old training field, the evening grew darker, and the few passers-by he'd seen earlier drifted away. By the time he reached the cleared arena, night had fully fallen, and the area was deserted. He came to a halt at the field's edge. Turning toward the shadowy line of trees behind him, he called out, "You've been trailing me long enough. Show yourself." Silence answered. Only the chirp of insects drifted from the woods. A low chuckle escaped Nathan's lips. Still, he held his ground. Raising his hand, he pressed it gently against the seal on his forehead and whispered, "Release." In an instant, the intricate marking dissolved, revealing his pale, all-seeing eye. Concentrating fully, Nathan activated its power. His vision cut through every leaf and limb within a kilometer, effortlessly sweeping the darkness for signs of movement. Before long, he spotted a flicker of motion high in a nearby tree. With no hint of surprise, Nathan pivoted to face it. Perched among the branches sat a lone figure, no longer hidden. The confrontation was about to begin. Most of the figure was draped in branches and leaves, leaving only a pair of eyes visible. Even so, Nathan could tell at a glance that he wore a black robe and a lacquered mask, an unmistakable Anbu uniform. That confirmed his suspicion. Without a second thought, Nathan activated his Sharingan. 3 obsidian tomoi flared into being, collapsed inward, and merged into the shape of a dark sun. In that instant, he had opened his Mangekyo Sharingan. The masked man gave no sign of shock. He simply closed his eyes, spun on his heel, and dashed deeper into the woods. Nathan had no intention of letting him escape. Summoning the power of his left eye, he invoked his space-time technique, Heaven's Guard. In the same breath, he vanished. Not far ahead, the Anbu operative vaulted over two low-hanging branches, convinced he'd gained distance. Then, with no warning, Nathan reappeared before him like a shadow made flesh. The man skidded to a halt, too late to avoid the trap. Thanks to a recent surge in his Sharingan's power, now registering over 30,000 out of 50,000, Nathan could sustain Heaven's Guard for more than 40 seconds. At his enhanced speed, 40 seconds was plenty of time to cover hundreds of meters. He closed the gap to the hidden watcher with ease, and this time, the man couldn't evade his gaze. The moment their eyes met, Nathan activated his Genjutsu Sharingan, trapping the man's consciousness in an inescapable illusion. With the prowess of a Mangekyo-level Sharingan, Nathan's Genjutsu was simply overwhelming. Without a word, Nathan seized the man by the shoulders and hauled him along. Through his Byakugan-enhanced perception, he confirmed that no one else was within a kilometer. And yet, staying in one place was too risky. He pushed deeper into the forest until he reached a secluded glade. There he set the man on his feet, formed a hand seal, and invoked the chakra absorption technique. Placing both palms on the man's chest, Nathan drew out every drop of chakra, and with it, most of the man's mental and physical vitality in mere seconds. But Nathan knew this was only the beginning. Nathan raised his hand, channeling his chakra into a blade of searing energy, the chakra scalpel. With 3 swift arcs, he severed the man's major nerves and muscle groups. Even if the prisoner regained consciousness, he would be utterly helpless. Satisfied that the operative could no longer resist, Nathan dove into his mind. An illusion unfurled before the man's eyes, gently guiding him to relive key moments. Nathan watched the memories play out, noting blank gaps where powerful seals had been laid. And then he saw it. The code name 169, Books and Bars. That was all the confirmation he needed. This man was one of Danzo's root agents, only they used seals so numerous and so ruthless. Nathan had encountered similar memory seals on Aburame Ryoma and others, but his technique was unconventional. By constructing a carefully tailored illusion, he coaxed the target to reveal memories that even the root's wards couldn't fully hide. He also knew that root operatives typically left mission-specific memories unsealed until they'd completed their orders. It was a security measure, and one that had just given Nathan the answers he needed. 15 minutes after he'd begun the mental probe, Nathan dispelled the illusion. He now knew for certain that Danzo had sent this agent to watch him, and that knowledge would prove invaluable in the days to come. Moments later, the root operative groaned back to consciousness. He fixed Nathan with a savage glare and lunged, claws outstretched, determined to tear him apart the instant his eyes opened. But Nathan didn't give him the chance. A sharp crackle split the air. From Nathan's outstretched palm, a sinuous bolt of lightning hissed into existence and struck the ninja squarely in the chest. The stench of burning flesh and blood hit Nathan's nostrils, an unwelcome echo of the barbecue he'd just devoured, and he frowned. Withdrawing his hand, he watched the agent collapse, life extinguished. Nathan's fingers danced through the air, sealing hand signs for a second jutsu. Fire style, flame disintegration, he intoned. A roaring sphere of flame materialized, engulfing the fallen shinobi in an instant. When the blaze died, only a pile of white ash remained. Nathan exhaled, molding his chakra into a gust of wind that scattered the ashes among the undergrowth and drifting leaves. No need to linger. With a swift exhalation, Nathan activated his flash step technique and vanished from the clearing. His destination lay clear in his mind, the gates of the Uchiha clan, where urgent matters awaited his arrival. Nathan returned to his quarters, poured himself a glass of water, and settled into his chair. As he sipped, he reviewed the only solid piece of intelligence he'd gathered. His mark was one of Danzo's operatives. Nothing else he'd learned held real value, except that. Nathan knew that once Danzo discovered his man had vanished, he'd unleash hell. Given his target's ruthless disposition, things would only get uglier from there. If Nathan could eliminate him first, he'd avoid becoming collateral. With a plan forming in his mind, Nathan drained the glass, set it aside, and rose. He made for the training hall, but tonight he would refrain from practicing the loudest techniques, wind style, Rasen shuriken, water style, great shark bullet technique, and the shuriken shadow clone technique, all sure to trigger Konoha's sensory barrier. Instead, he'd focus on quieter drills for now and save the noisier jutsu for tomorrow, once he'd slipped beyond the village's borders. Meanwhile, Nathan had set a trap for Danzo, and now everything hinged on whether Danzo dared to take the bait. Chapter 648, Emergency in the Shadows. Night cloaked the hidden recesses of Konoha village, where far beneath the surface, Root's underground headquarters lay concealed. In a sparsely lit office, Danzo sat behind his desk, methodically flipping through a stack of classified dossiers. A sharp knock at the door snapped his attention away from the papers. "Enter," he called, closing the dossier in his hand. The door swung open. A Root operative named Yi strode in, his expression tense. Danzo looked up, steepling his fingers. "Yi, report." "Lord Danzo," Yi replied, voice low and precise. "Shadow Ghost failed to make his scheduled check-in." Danzo's brow creased. "Explain." "Half an hour ago was the fixed contact time," Yi continued. "We received no signal from Shadow Ghost, so I dispatched the Red Shadow team to track him down." "And their findings?" Danzo asked, his tone even. "The team followed his trail to the 7th Martial Arts Arena," Yi said. "But once they reached the arena, every sign of him vanished." Danzo leaned back, his expression unreadable. He let the silence hang for a moment before asking, "Did you search the arena thoroughly?" "We did," Yi confirmed. "Not a trace. He's completely gone." A distant clock ticked in the quiet room. Danzo's eyes narrowed as he absorbed the news. Losing an operative was one thing. Losing Shadow Ghost, one of Root's most trusted agents, was unthinkable. "Very well," Danzo said at last, his voice cold. "Mobilize every available squad. Have them question every contact he made in the last 24 hours. Bring me any information, alive or dead, on Shadow Ghost's whereabouts." "Yes, my lord," Yi replied, bowing stiffly before turning on his heel and disappearing through the door. Alone again, Danzo stared at the closed dossier before him. In the world of Root, disappearances were never accidents. Somewhere, someone held the key to Shadow Ghost's fate, and Danzo intended to find out who. Right now, we have no confirmation whether the Shadow Ghost is alive or dead. Danzo's face darkened. He pressed on, his voice low and urgent. "Where is this brat now?" "He's back at his residence," Agent B replied crisply. Danzo leaned forward. "Anything unusual at the site where the Shadow Ghost vanished?" "No," B said, shaking his head. "Our Red Shadow team swept the area thoroughly. There were no signs left behind. No footprints, no struggle, no clue of any kind. It's as if he simply dissolved into thin air." Danzo's expression grew even more severe. He imagined the Shadow Ghost, an undercover Root operative assigned to monitor Nathan, vanishing without a trace. Of course, Nathan had the Byakugan to pinpoint his target's location in an instant. Then he'd employed the fabled Heaven's Control jutsu to teleport himself close enough to strike. With a flicker of his Sharingan, he cast a powerful genjutsu, seized the Shadow Ghost's mind, and spirited him away without so much as a whispered alarm. As if that weren't astounding enough, Nathan had repeated the heavenly control technique a second time to leave the site utterly untraceable, erasing every footprint and trace of chakra behind him. Danzo stared ahead, mind racing. If even the elite Red Shadow team couldn't track this boy, what did that mean for their entire Root network? The answer chilled him to the bone. Though Shadow Ghost's fate remains uncertain and there's no direct evidence linking the incident to Nathan, his unscathed return home poses a serious problem. Danzo had specifically ordered Shadow Ghost to keep Nathan under close surveillance, and barring any extraordinary event, the spy would have followed his target to the ends of the earth. Yet Nathan arrived at his residence without a hitch, and Shadow Ghost simply vanished. Danzo didn't need long to draw a grim conclusion. Shadow Ghost was almost certainly dead. Even so, he never imagined Nathan would be so ruthless. In Danzo's mind, if the spy had uncovered Nathan's plan, the younger man would have done what past Uchiha operatives did, slipped away quietly, and found another way to dodge detection. Instead, Nathan shattered every expectation and threw the entire operation into chaos. Danzo, preoccupied with helping Orochimaru vie for the 4th Hokage title, had only paid lip service to watching Nathan, never once thinking the young Uchiha would actually kill someone. Danzo slammed his fist onto the desk. He could have left even a single clue, some excuse for us to strike back. But Nathan was too thorough. He vanished without a trace, and now we're stuck with nothing but egg on our faces. He turned to his lieutenant, B. Effective immediately. Dispatch 2 teams to tail that kid. The moment he makes a move again, don't show him an ounce of mercy. He can't possibly wipe out 2 squads without raising an alarm. Just grab him. B opened his mouth, hesitated. Sir, is the timing right? Should we? Enough, Danzo cut him off with a wave. Do exactly as I say. Yes, sir. B replied, bowing sharply. Good, Danzo said, dismissing him with a flick of his wrist. Make the arrangements now. As B hurried away, Danzo leaned back, lips curled in a satisfied smirk. He would not let Nathan slip through his fingers again. Yes. Agent B's terse reply lingered in the air before he turned on his heel and strode from the office. No sooner had the door clicked shut than Danzo allowed the tension to drain from his features. His earlier display of anger hadn't been merely personal, it was a calculated strike at the Uchiha clan. Until now, he had been careful to avoid open friction with them. But recent intelligence had revealed that most of the Uchiha Jonin were throwing their support behind Namikaze Minato's bid for 4th Hokage. Within days, their collective endorsement would be finalized, and the backing of one of Konoha's wealthiest families would give Minato an overwhelming advantage. This was precisely the turn Danzo could not allow. If he could sow enough doubt to fracture the Uchiha alliance, all the better. And if that failed, at least he would have identified, and could eliminate, a serious internal threat. He raised his hand to rest on the bandages over his right eye. His suspicions told him Nathan might already have awakened the legendary Mangekyo Sharingan. Nathan's standard 3 Tomoe Sharingan had proven formidable, but the Mangekyo, if his guess was correct, the balance of power within the village could shift in an instant. Nathan considered the possibilities. If he could replace his current eye with an even more powerful Dotsu, his strength would surge, and with it, his confidence in the coming Hokage race. Across the village, Danzo was nursing the same ambition. He still dreamed of claiming the title himself, and he had no doubt that he could eliminate Nathan once and for all. Admittedly, Danzo had suffered defeat at Nathan's hands several times over the past 2 years, but those losses had come when he was distracted by other priorities, dispatching only a handful of operatives and leaving critical details to chance. Now, however, he had painstakingly covered every angle. When the opportune moment arrived, he would unleash his full power, and he was certain there would be no more mistakes. Danzo's confidence in his own strength burned bright. Nathan, too, felt resolute. His shadow ghost informant had warned him that Danzo suspected the existence of his Mangekyo Sharingan, but he still didn't grasp the eye's true might. Danzo's vague orders to his agents and his later, faltering clash with Sasuke both proved that much. So why should Nathan feel fear? After all, the Sharingan was only one aspect of his arsenal, and he had plenty more secrets waiting in reserve. Nathan's immense chakra reserves and his mastery of flawless, high-level ninjutsu were a fundamental pillar of his confidence. Chapter 649, The Plan. At dawn, Nathan stirred awake. He lay in bed for a moment, listening to the hush of the Uchiha compound. He didn't even need to activate his Byakugan to know he was being watched. He'd sensed the same eyes on him last night while he was training. 2 root teams sent by Danzo had been skulking about, but Nathan had refused to act on impulse. This was Uchiha territory, and he had no desire to make matters worse. It wasn't fear of endangering the Uchiha or of facing Danzo's root operatives. Nathan simply didn't want extra complications. His objective remained as straightforward as ever: eliminate Danzo and seize Root's private archives. He had no interest in embroiling himself in the Uchiha's internal disputes or in their tensions with the village and with Danzo. With that in mind, he intended not only to avoid confrontation here, but also to lure the enemy away from these grounds. Nathan rose, washed quickly, and slung his ninja pack over his shoulder. As he stepped outside onto the quiet street, he immediately detected the faint but unmistakable presence of root operatives tailing him. A slight smile touched his lips. Let them follow. As soon as they were clear of the Uchiha lands, he would show them exactly why they should never underestimate him. Nathan strode down the street until he spotted a small breakfast stall. He ordered rice balls and tea, satisfied his hunger, and then continued toward Konoha's gate. A low mist clung to the village walls, but Nathan recognized the familiar wooden palisade immediately. 2 Konoha guards on watch glanced up as he approached. They looked surprised to see a shinobi out so early, but since the village didn't forbid its own ninja from traveling, they simply nodded and let him pass. Once he was well beyond the gate, Nathan dropped his cloak, steadied his breathing, and unleashed a pair of wind-style techniques in swift succession. Feathers of whirling green chakra spiraled around his arms to form wind wings, then layered across his torso in a protective feathered cloak. With a powerful thrust, he launched himself into the air and rose above the treetops. From high above, he cast one last look at Konoha. The grand oaks that framed the village gate lay quietly below, and a confident smirk tugged at his lips. Then, gathering speed, he streaked through the clouds like a living arrow. Hidden among the trees at the forest's edge, 8 root operatives watched his ascent in silence. They leaned forward, ready to give chase, but Nathan's speed and wind style made pursuit impossible. At last, as his form vanished into the morning sky, one of them broke the hush. "What do we do now?" he asked. Captain Arata exchanged a brief look with Captain Sora, then nodded. "All right, let's fall back." The dozen or so root ninjas under their command didn't argue. There was nothing more to gain here tonight. Better to head home, file their reports, and let the elders sort it all out. With that settled, the 2 squads melted into the shadows and vanished toward the village. Hardly a minute passed before Nathan reappeared in the same clearing. No ripple in the air, no telltale shimmer of space. He had simply tapped into the power of heaven and manifested out of thin air. Instantly, he activated his white eyes and watched the retreating figures go. He could have struck then and there. He was more than confident he'd dispatch every one of them without leaving a trace. But these were just pawns. Danzo was his true quarry. After a silent moment, Nathan folded up into the night once more, already plotting his next move. Nathan felt no doubt about his own strength, and he was convinced Danzo wouldn't give him much trouble. But a lion must face a rabbit at full force. To avoid mistakes and spare himself needless complications, he resolved to prepare thoroughly. After all, he might still need those subordinates to guide Danzo later, and he couldn't afford to overreach or risk angering his rival. With that in mind, Nathan slipped quietly out of the village and headed for a remote stretch of forest. He hovered above the treetops, circling the woodland several times, his sharp vision probing every shadow. The terrain was perfect until he spotted the problem. A cluster of small villages and a busy town lay just beyond the forest's edge. Any loud training session here would draw unwanted attention, something he was determined to avoid. Reluctantly, Nathan shook his head, gave the forest one last glance, and lifted off again. He would find somewhere more isolated, somewhere he could train without disturbing anyone or tipping his hand. Nathan's flying speed was more than enough to scour the vast reaches of the Fire Country until he finally discovered the perfect hideaway. By mid-morning, after scanning more than a dozen locations through the 16-9 Book Bar network, he settled on a remote forest along the southern coast. Around it lay untamed wastelands, no villages, no major roads or military outposts, and therefore no ninja patrols. It was exactly the kind of place he needed, an ideal training ground and a private battlefield where any noise he made would go unnoticed, at least for the time being. That margin of safety was all Nathan required for now. Yet he refused to rush into tempting Danzo with an obvious trap. Danzo's reputation for betrayal meant that any clumsy provocation might only alert him. If Danzo chose not to take the bait, Nathan's entire scheme would collapse before it even began. He needed patience and a long-term strategy to draw his target in and ensure victory when the time was right. Nathan considered his next move carefully. The only way to lure a root ninja into a false sense of security was to appear entirely unguarded, make him think he'd spotted an easy target, then strike when he least expected it. To pull that off, Nathan needed to give his opponent a trail to follow, a way to pinpoint his location without raising any alarms. Fortunately, the plan was simpler than it sounded. Root's operatives weren't omniscient. They still relied on observation posts and gradual triangulation when they couldn't use flying ninjutsu. If Nathan deliberately left traces, subtle but consistent markers along his route, the ninja would slowly lock onto his position, convinced they had the upper hand. The key was not to hide at all, but to cultivate the illusion of vulnerability. Over the next few days, Nathan would return to this spot, refining his footwork and leaving just enough evidence of his presence. Then, when the enemy finally closed in, he'd be ready to turn the tables. The beauty of the scheme lay in its simplicity. Fewer moving parts meant fewer chances for error. Satisfied with his decision, Nathan wasted no time. He picked a high vantage point, took a deep breath, and dropped straight down, resolved to set his plan in motion. As soon as his feet hit the ground, Nathan formed a hand seal and unleashed the multiple shadow clone technique, instantly spawning 6 perfect copies of himself. He glanced over his new clones, assigned each a specific training routine, and then slipped away. Finding a quiet clearing, Nathan settled cross-legged on the earth and began cycling through the palm immortal technique and the reflection heart technique. With each controlled breath, he reinforced his body while pushing the evolution of his Sharingan forward. Minute by minute, the world shrank to nothing but his steady heartbeat and the flow of chakra. Before long, Nathan had devoted his entire mind and body to nothing but relentless practice. Chapter 650, Perfection and Breakthrough. Sunset gave way to moonrise, and night fell in the blink of an eye. Nathan drew back his shadow clones, absorbing each one's hour of training in a surge of chakra. On his skill panel, he saw that one of his ninjutsu techniques had just leveled up. He paused for a moment, eyes narrowing as he committed the new details to memory. Then, with renewed energy, he leapt toward the clearing where his clones had been sparring. Raising his hands, he formed the familiar seals and cast the shadow clone technique, sending a fresh duplicate slinking off into the shadows. No sooner had that clone departed than he wove another rapid series of seals and unleashed his upgraded jutsu. Water style, Great Samadan technique. After 2 weeks of relentless practice, the technique had finally climbed from level 8, 41,750,000, to level 9, 00. A quick correction to chapters 6 and 45. It's the water style, Great Samadan technique that's ready for promotion, not the wind style, Rasen Shuriken. That one will take another month. At perfect mastery, the Great Samadan still took the form of a massive, thrashing shark, every bit as imposing as before. But Nathan could feel the difference now, greater precision, stronger flow, and a power tempered by his disciplined control. This breakthrough marked another step on his path to true ninja perfection. Nathan could instantly feel the jutsu's internal stability had jumped by more than 1 rank, meaning it could now consume far stronger techniques. The proof came swiftly. In the distance, his shadow clone fixed its gaze on the shark-shaped chakra missile hurtling straight at it. With lightning reflexes, the clone gathered chakra and formed the seals for fire style, Great Fireball Jutsu. A scorching torrent of flame burst from its mouth, spiraling outward until it coalesced into a sphere more than 20 meters across. In raw destructive power, this fireball rivaled any known B-rank ninjutsu. But even that colossal inferno stood no chance. The instant the fireball met the water shark summoned by water style, Great Samadan Jutsu, the beast opened its maw and swallowed the flames whole, extinguishing them in less than a second. And that was against a fire-style attack. If it had been any other element, Nathan's perfected technique would have consumed it even faster. After raising Great Samadan Jutsu to perfection at level 9, 00, it had clearly transcended its former limits. Previously, Nathan had succeeded in overcoming many of this technique's weaknesses. On top of that, his efficiency in converting absorbed chakra has soared. Take the current moment, for example. After swallowing the fireball unleashed by his shadow clone, Nathan's form ballooned to monstrous proportions, like a colossal shark, exuding an almost palpable sense of intimidation. Naturally, his raw attack power rose with it. Although offensive might isn't the technique's primary purpose, any boost is still welcome. Perfecting this skill also deepened Nathan's mastery of water nature chakra. He gained fresh insights into both its shape transformations and its fundamental properties. The former insight alone bumped his chakra control proficiency up by roughly 1,000 points, pushing his progress meter well past the 60% mark, and subtly improved the efficiency of his other skills. Since this wasn't a full promotion, the gains weren't dramatic, but they were nonetheless meaningful. As for the latter, Nathan's perfected water release. Explosive water wave suddenly shattered its limits, and his proficiency jumped from level 700 to level 7 120,000, proof that the jutsu could still be improved. With that breakthrough, it was no longer the same technique. It had matured into an A-rank ninjutsu. From this moment on, it would be known as water release, great explosive water wave. Originally, Nathan had intended to track down and acquire this skill after dealing with Danzo's machinations. Fate, however, had granted it to him now, without the detour. Raising his hand, he formed the seals for the great explosive water wave. In the next instant, a colossal sphere of water materialized around him. It billowed outward with frightening speed until it spanned a full kilometer in radius. Anyone who challenged him inside that watery dome would be utterly engulfed, their fighting capability all but nullified. There was, however, one critical weakness. Nathan could not breathe underwater as effortlessly as Hoshigaki Kisame. Without gills, he would have to release the jutsu and surface for air before long. Nathan knew that, for now, his water release ninjutsu remained limited. Until he could employ his human transformation ability to evolve so he could breathe underwater or survive without oxygen, the technique's full might would elude him. Even so, it was a powerful jutsu. Simply reshaping the battlefield's terrain justified the time and chakra he poured into it. He pictured the day he mastered the water style, great shark bullet technique, and began saving 87,000 chakra points every day, chakra he could then channel into this very art. At present, his proficiency stood at level 7 out of 20,000. But A-rank water release jutsu topped out at level 9, and he needed another 70,000 points to reach it. Nathan let his senses drift to the water coursing around him, then cracked open his hand seals. With a resonant gush, torrents of water sprang free, sweeping across the clearing until the jungle floor lay submerged beneath an instant ocean. He paid no heed to the ruin he'd wrought below. Once his chakra settled, he formed a new seal and thrust his palm forward. Water style, great explosive water wave. A towering crest of churning water erupted, roaring with destructive force as it bore down on everything in its path. Nathan steeled himself, ready to refine the technique with every fiber of his being. Nathan decided not to push the new technique to its limits. Instead, he channeled just enough chakra to register a proficiency gain, then dispelled the jutsu and began again. Over and over, he repeated the cycle, 10 times in all. When he reviewed his chakra expenditure against the proficiency increases, the numbers became clear. Each practice cost roughly 120 chakra points for a modest boost. Even if he dedicated every one of the 87,000 chakra points he could spare each day, having already perfected water style, great Simadama Jutsu, it would still take him a full 3 months to master the water style, great explosive water wave. That timeline would do him no good in the looming showdown with Danzo. With that cold calculation in mind, Nathan reluctantly shelved his plans for the explosive water technique and refocused on wind style, Rasen Shuriken. 2 weeks of relentless practice later, his proficiency climbed to level 9, sitting at 53,581 out of 100,000, just over 46,000 points shy of reaching the next tier. Nathan stared at the floating display before him, weighing his options. If he poured all 87,000 chakra points into his cultivation technique, he'd reach the next level in about 18 days. But he couldn't afford to put off his decisive battle with Danzo for that long. Waiting 20 days made no sense. That left only one path. Focus the entire cache of chakra on mastering the chakra feather garb. Over the last half-month, his proficiency had climbed from level 8, 18,250,000, to level 8, 31,550,000. At the normal rate of 950 points per day, he'd still need almost 20 days to hit level 9. Yet by expending an extra 87,000 chakra points right now, his daily gain would jump to 1,820 points, cutting the required time down to just 10 days. 10 days was short enough that Danzo might delay their final confrontation, especially if he stayed on his guard. By then, Nathan's promotion to level 900 would represent a genuine leap in strength and a far safer position from which to face his foe. While he didn't truly believe Danzo posed a mortal threat at his current level, he knew there was no harm in forging just a bit more power. He took a deep breath and checked the timing one last time. If everything aligned, it would be the perfect moment to invest his chakra and sharpen the edge he'd need. If not, he'd stick to the original plan. Either way, he was ready. At his current strength, Danzo simply wasn't a match for Nathan. Determined to improve, Nathan decided to take things one step at a time. He didn't waste a moment, relocating to a quieter spot before diving back into his training. Chapter 651, Trap. 2 hours later, the night had grown deep when Nathan finally wrapped up the bulk of his ninjutsu training. He still had 3 techniques to master: the multi-shadow clone technique, the painstakingly precise palm fairy technique, and the subtle reflection heart technique. But darkness was falling, and the gates of Konoha were about to close. Not being Ambu, he lacked the secret code to pass through the village's barrier undetected. A rash attempt to slip inside now would almost certainly trigger an alarm, inviting untold complications. Deciding it was safer to return for the night, Nathan doused the bonfire, gathered his belongings, and prepared to depart. He hand-sealed 2 jutsu in quick succession: wind style, wind wings, and chakra feather clothing. With a soft whoosh, he transformed into a streak of green light and shot skyward, speeding toward Konoha. More than half an hour later, he coasted down to the village's outskirts. The guards had long since withdrawn, and only a handful of late-night wanderers remained near the gate. Nathan's heart quickened. Whatever lay ahead, the real test would begin once he slipped inside. Nathan stepped through the village gates under the watchful eyes of 2 gatekeeper shinobi. He hadn't gone far when a familiar presence prickled his senses, the same person who'd trailed him that morning. Rather than feign ignorance, Nathan followed the feeling up to a raised platform on his right. Perched there in a black robe and mask stood a ninja from Root. They locked eyes, neither uttering a word. Nathan's face went cold as they stared at each other, each pupil revealing the 3 Tomoe Sharingan. Time seemed to slow. Curious villagers passing by noticed the unusual tension, but Nathan remained perfectly still, unwavering in his gaze. Finally, the masked shinobi chose discretion over confrontation. In the blink of an eye, he melted into the shadows and was gone. Nathan relaxed his stance and, as if nothing had happened, strolled toward the village's busiest street. Half an hour later, Nathan finished his evening meal and returned to his home. Without wasting a moment, he settled into a meditative stance and began practicing the multi-shadow clone technique. Within seconds, his figure multiplied across the room, dozens of Nathans training in perfect unison, inside and out of the house. Nathan's family estate lay well off the beaten path, so he never had to worry about disturbing neighbors during his training. Tonight, he spent more than an hour in the courtyard drilling his strikes and footwork until he'd completed the session he'd planned for himself. Satisfied, he opened the status panel at his wrist, noted that his proficiency had climbed just as expected, then turned toward the small training room attached to the house. There, he resumed his exercises, alternating between the Palm Immortal technique and the Reflection Heart technique, to build raw power and further his Sharingan's evolution. Time slipped by, almost unnoticed, as he pushed himself to the limit. By the time he finally lowered his arms, the moon was high in the sky and the clock close to midnight. His body and mind ached with fatigue. Nathan headed for the bathhouse, quickly washing away the sweat and grime of training, then returned to his bedroom to rest. But before he crawled under the covers, he reached up and released the guardian seal between his eyebrows. His vision shifted, and his Byakugan-tinged white eyes flickered to life. Scanning the grounds, he spotted only 2 figures stationed outside, a marked decrease from yesterday's watch. Nathan frowned. Danzo must have decided he posed no immediate threat here and pared down the surveillance team. With that small confirmation, he deactivated his dojutsu, resealed his brow, and finally allowed himself to drift into sleep. Nathan wasn't the least bit concerned. No matter how many enemy operatives were lurking, his sleep was untouchable. He had no intention of making the first move. If anyone was going to act, it would be Danzo. Having proven his ruthlessness and skill in every battle over the past 2 years, Danzo wouldn't strike without absolute certainty of success. Besides, Nathan's battlefield instincts had been honed to razor sharpness. Even if an assassin somehow got the drop on him, he could jolt awake in an instant, and once his heavenly guard activated, no weapon or jutsu could harm him. In short, Nathan slept easy. Before he knew it, dawn had broken. Early morning light filtered through the curtains as Nathan opened his eyes and scanned the room. No surprises. The 2 Ambu guards were still posted outside, their stances unchanged. Such unwavering dedication, worthy of true root operatives, surpassed anything he'd ever seen from ordinary shinobi. Nathan stifled a small sigh, swung his legs over the side of the bed, and pushed himself to his feet. With a long stretch, he made his way to the bathroom, ready to start the day. Nathan was done washing up in just a few minutes. Grabbing his ninja satchel, he stepped outside. He was starving and ready to find something to eat. He hadn't gone far when a voice called after him. "Nathan, wait up!" He turned, spotting a familiar face, though not a close friend, approaching him. It was Uchiha Haruto, the jonin who'd quietly sent him a stipend the moment he'd crossed over into this world. By some miracle, Haruto had survived the Great Ninja War. "Haruto?" Nathan greeted him, brow furrowing in curiosity. "What's up?" Despite being more than 10 years older by birth, Haruto and Nathan were technically the same generation in the ninja ranks. Back when Nathan was still a chunin, he'd shown the veteran jonin every courtesy. Now that he himself was a jonin, his tone had grown more direct, and a touch less deferential. Nathan glanced up as Uchiha Haruto's voice broke the silence. Haruto didn't react to Nathan's tone shift, only asked, "Where did you go yesterday?" Nathan frowned for a moment, then relaxed his shoulders. "I went beyond the village to train. What's wrong?" After all, everyone knew he was obsessed with improving his skills. No need for lies. What really piqued his curiosity was why the clan had summoned all the jonin so soon after the war's end. Haruto nodded, as if Nathan's answer had been expected. At yesterday's council meeting, the elders discussed the upcoming Hokage election. They wanted to hear everyone's thoughts. Nathan's eyes lit up. And what's the consensus? Nearly everyone agreed to throw their support behind Jonin Minato, Haruto said. The clan has officially decided to back him as the 4th Hokage. Nathan nodded. I have no objections. Uchiha Jito gave a small bow. Very well. I'll pass your response along to the clan leader. They exchanged a few more polite words before parting. It was obvious Jito had been waiting here to test Nathan's loyalties. From the way he spoke about Minato Namikaze, Nathan realized Jito was firmly in Minato's camp. Had he answered differently, Jito might have tried to persuade him. Nathan couldn't help thinking with a wry smile, Minato really is popular. If even the Uchiha had so many supporters backing him, it spoke volumes. Lost in thought, Nathan pressed onward. Just as he had the day before, he stopped at a street vendor's breakfast stall, filled his stomach, then slipped quietly out of the village gates. High above the forest canopy, Nathan activated his Byakugan and swept the landscape below. As expected, dozens of hidden figures trailed him, root operatives using every ounce of speed and stealth to keep up. Nathan's heart sank as he realized the truth. I've been played. Without hesitation, he unleashed a burst of chakra and shot off toward the training ground he'd scouted just yesterday. His speed was so overwhelming that the root shinobi trailing him soon lost all trace of their quarry. Nathan didn't ease up or drop any misleading clues. Any slip in his act would only ring alarm bells for Danzo. After all, there's a reason people prize what they can't easily seize. Once they've endured countless trials to claim it, they let their guard down entirely. So he wore the part of the arrogant youth to perfection, outwardly confident, brushing off the threat of pursuers while relying on his unparalleled swiftness to keep them at bay. Inside, though, he tightened his resolve. Every step forward brought him closer to turning this deception back against his enemies. Chapter 652, Delay in Promotion. A week slipped by almost unnoticed. At Root's headquarters in Konoha, Danzo sat behind his desk, methodically reviewing the latest surveillance report. After a moment, he set it aside, his cold gaze turning to the ninja standing before him. Have you locked onto their position? He asked. Yes, my lord, the operative, codenamed B, replied. Danzo nodded. Good. The Red Shadow and Gray Eagle teams have narrowed down the target's activity zone. We should be able to pinpoint the exact location within a day or two. A faint, almost imperceptible smile curved Danzo's lips, enough to reveal his satisfaction. He leaned forward. B. Begin preparations at once. Follow the plan we outlined. Evacuate our assets from the village in stages. The moment we have a confirmed spot on the target, you will strike immediately. B. bowed crisply. Understood, sir. Danzo sat back, watching his subordinate with approving eyes. Everything was unfolding exactly as he intended. Danzo gave a curt nod and waved his hand. You may go. Understood. The Ambu known only as B slipped from the room, closing the sliding door with a soft click. Left alone, Danzo retrieved the surveillance report from his desk and scanned it once more. After a moment, he tossed it aside, leaned back in his chair, and steepled his fingers on the edge of the desk. His narrowed eyes stared into nothingness, the only sound in the room, the faint tap of fingernails against wood. Far from the walls of Konoha, Nathan hovered above the forest canopy. Through the slit of his Leaf Village forehead protector, his pale, unblinking eyes swept the trees below. There, root operatives, concealed in small squads among the trunks and underbrush. He'd seen several such teams tracking him all along his route. Proof that his plan was working. Root's hunters were locked onto his trail. Yet timing was not on his side. According to his calculations, his Chakra Hagoromo technique would not reach its next level for another 3 days. But these Root Shinobi would hardly need that long to zero in on his exact position, perhaps only a day or two. Once they did, they wouldn't dawdle. To prevent him from slipping away under cover of night or the restless dreams that fueled his power, they'd strike without warning. Nathan's jaw tightened. He had to buy himself more time, fast. Nathan knew that sticking to his usual route would only increase the risk of being tracked. To buy himself extra time, he veered off course instead of heading straight ahead. After a few powerful wing beats, he was already a great distance from where he'd begun. Below him, hidden among the trees, a squad of Root operatives emerged. They glanced upward at Nathan's disappearing silhouette, their expressions grim behind their masks. One of them finally broke the silence. Did he notice us? They had expected something like this. Over the past week, they'd tailed Nathan, piecing together his likely heading and slowly constricting their net. Yet this sudden change in direction threw their calculations into doubt and stoked their suspicions. Still, they remained rooted to the spot. There was no room for error now. Danzo's orders were absolute. If it meant losing the target, so be it, but under no circumstances were they to reveal their presence to Nathan. With that in mind, they melted back into the forest, determined to reestablish the hunt on Nathan's next move. There was no other choice. Nathan's aerial ninjutsu was simply too unpredictable. If he realized he was being watched, the last week of effort would have been for nothing. So they opted for the most cautious plan, and Nathan, unwittingly, cooperated. He slipped just beyond the Root surveillance perimeter, then took a quiet detour into the southern woods. A quick sweep of that area will let the Root operatives confirm he hasn't gone far. They'll assume his disappearance was an accident and wait for him to return to his usual routines tomorrow. At most, they'll lose a day repositioning their assets, hardly a setback compared to the emission deadline Lord Danzo has imposed. Meanwhile, Nathan gains exactly 24 extra hours to hone his technique. By the time the Root ninjas lock onto his precise location again, he'll be on the verge of mastering his new chakra feather cloak. Delays like this were unavoidable. If Nathan returned too often or too late, Root and Danzo would grow suspicious. A single missed report might be excused as an unforeseen complication, but repeated absences would raise alarm bells. Fortunately, he only needed this one extra trip back to the forest. Without wasting a moment, Nathan formed the necessary hand seals and unleashed the multiple shadow clone technique. 5 perfect duplicates sprang to life around him. He quickly assigned each clone a specific ninjutsu to drill: chakra control, elemental molding, complex sealing jutsu, then sent them off into the trees. Meanwhile, Nathan settled into his own training, focusing every ounce of his chakra into perfecting a single technique. Every hour on the dot, he absorbed his clones, drawing in their memories and the muscle memory their bodies had developed. With each reintegration, These experiences solidified into his own proficiency, deepening his mastery of every practiced skill. No sooner had he absorbed one set of clones than he spawned a new batch, sending them back into their rigorous regimen. Train, recall, absorb, repeat, over and over again, until each jutsu shone with newfound precision. 3 days passed in what felt like mere moments. And now, this morning, after Nathan once again absorbed his Shadow Clone's training experience and memories, his chakra feather robe advanced to a new tier. Just as he'd anticipated, reaching the perfected state at level 9, brought a qualitative leap in its power. At level 8, the robe, despite granting an endless life effect, could only withstand 2 C-rank ninjutsu strikes or 10 D-rank attacks per second, and would collapse instantly under even a single B-rank technique. Now, however, Nathan could tangibly feel its newfound solidity. He sealed the necessary hand signs, activated the Shadow Clone technique, and produced a duplicate wearing the upgraded robe. Then he began his experiment. One after another, he hurled D and C-rank ninjutsu at the clone. Seconds ticked by, then minutes, until nearly 10 minutes later, Nathan finally stopped. He'd confirmed that with the enhanced Endless Life trait, the Chakra Feather Robe could effectively shrug off any D-rank or lower ninjutsu indefinitely, so long as his chakra held out, and even absorb 7 or 8 C-rank attacks per second without faltering. Even 2 B-rank ninjutsu attacks couldn't break it, proof enough of the Guardian Seal's power. The realization strengthened Nathan's confidence for the coming fight. He peeled the seal from his brow, activated his Byakugan, and swept the surrounding kilometer for any sign of hidden root shinobi. He already knew they'd pinpointed his location. Now, he simply waited for their next move. Chapter 53. Strike first to gain the upper hand. Nathan's gaze snapped eastward, locking onto the lone figure of Shimura Danzo. Exactly as he had anticipated, Danzo had taken command in person rather than sending subordinates. Sensing he was being watched, Danzo paused mid-conversation with his hidden root operatives and slowly raised his head. For a tense moment, their eyes met across the expanse, despite the hundreds of meters separating them. Then Danzo's stern expression vanished, and he turned away, as if he had never noticed Nathan at all. Nathan exhaled and relaxed his posture. With a subtle hand motion, he dispelled the experimental shadow clone he'd been testing. No longer any need for subterfuge here. Danzo was clearly on high alert. Instead, Nathan pivoted sharply and sprinted westward, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the hidden root commander. His mission now was clear. Neutralize the root operatives scattered in that direction before Danzo could react. First strike, best chance of victory, he reminded himself, recalling the old shinobi adage. Until now, he had held back for 2 reasons. First, his mastery of the Chakra Hagoromo technique was incomplete, barely leveled at 9 out of 10, far from the perfect proficiency he craved. And second, he still lacked definitive proof of Danzo's exact location. Now that Danzo had exposed himself, Nathan's window had opened. Swiftly weaving through the underbrush, Nathan allowed himself a brief moment to attune to the flow of chakra around him. Each root ninja in the west would be caught off guard by his preemptive assault. By the time Danzo re-established his defenses, Nathan intended to have dismantled their operation entirely. With heart pounding and senses sharp, he vanished into the trees, ready to unleash his shadow clones in a coordinated assault. Strike first and seize the upper hand before the elusive Shimura Danzo could strike back. Now that Nathan wields both powers, courtesy is the first thing to go, and there's a simple reason he sent his subordinates in first: caution. Nathan had no idea how extensive Danzo's secret preparations were, but if he could clip Danzo's wings, there'd be nothing left to fear. With that in mind, Nathan raced toward the squad of root operatives. They'd only just received Danzo's warning when he struck, too late for them to flee. He didn't hesitate or stall for questions. The moment he arrived, he intended to kill. He activated his Mangekyo Sharingan, invoking the fabled Heaven's Control. Unseen, he closed the distance and then, like a phantom, materialized feet from them. In a blur of motion, he unleashed 2 techniques in rapid succession: a perfectly formed Rasengan directly into one agent's chest, followed by a razor-sharp chakra scalpel to sever another's defenses. Before any of the 4 could mount a defense, they hit the ground, mortally wounded. They lay there, eyes fixed on Nathan, oddly calm for men whose lives were ebbing away. But in that final heartbeat, the concealed explosive tags embedded in their vests detonated, sending a violent shockwave rippling outward. Nathan flared his chakra just in time to shield himself, even as the blast shook the leaves from the nearby trees. The first skirmish had ended, with him barely standing and the remainder of the mission still ahead. Boom, boom, boom. Explosions rippled through the night, both a signal to their allies and a crude attempt to catch Nathan off guard. He didn't flinch. Activating his heaven's control, he shrugged off the concussive force entirely, stepping away from the blast radius without leaving so much as a footprint. Through his calibrated white eyes, Nathan locked onto a nearby root squadron huddled in the darkness. Silently, he slipped into their midst and unleashed the same deadly ninjutsu sequence he'd used before. Though the recent detonations had the operatives on edge, heartbeats racing, senses sharpened, they never stood a chance. Tonight marked the first time Nathan had pushed his Mangekyo Sharingan's Hitomi Jutsu to its absolute limit. The result was a one-sided massacre. Root's finest, trained in desperation tactics, didn't even manage a cry of defiance. A handful of them resorted to self-destruct protocols, an ignoble end no more effective than stepping into Nathan's path. With the last embers of the explosions dying away, he melted back into the shadows, already zeroing in on his next target. 60 seconds later, Danzo stormed onto the scene, flanked by his own operatives, just in time to survey nothing but silence and ruin. Nathan's eyes darkened as he knelt beside the familiar body. His jaw clenched and a cold weight settled in his chest. Then, more explosions shattered the air, proof that yet another of his men had fallen. He rarely mourned the lives under his command, but losing so many at once stung. These were warriors he'd trained from scratch, and without them, several of his plans would crumble. Damn it. He rose to his feet and barked at the lieutenant standing by. Chen, send word to the Red Rain team, have them erect the barrier at once, then bring the rest of our forces in closer to my position. Yes, sir. Lieutenant Chen snapped a salute. He lifted his hand, wove a series of precise seals, and unleashed a secret spiritual transmission not unlike the mountain clan's heart-opening art. Within heartbeats, his message flew out to the hidden operatives. Moments later, a shimmering dome of energy sprang into being, arching over the clearing like a giant lid and sealing off a broad swath of jungle. Within its protective confines, Nathan's remaining troops hurried to reform their lines, steel in their eyes and resolve in their hearts. Somewhere deeper in the woods, unseen watchers paused at the sudden glow and smiled. Nathan had just dispatched the root ninja standing before him when he looked up and saw a shimmering barrier hanging in the sky. Oddly, he felt no panic. From past encounters with sealing techniques, he knew he could sidestep most of them with his heaven's control. Only the Gen organization's dreaded four-life sealing formation had ever managed to pin him down. Its suppression of both spirit and body left him weighed down until the seal was broken. But this barrier felt entirely different. When he'd shattered four-life seals before, he'd always known it by that creeping pressure. Now there was nothing. Coupled with the barrier's unfamiliar shape, Nathan was certain it wasn't the four-life formation at all. He relaxed. Then an icy prickle of awareness swept through his mind, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. In an instant, Nathan knew the barrier's true purpose. It wasn't designed to trap him. It was a perception dome, a constant tracking device set to pinpoint his location at every moment. Danzo must have studied Nathan's past battle record in detail. He knew the standard sealing barrier stood no chance against him. Confident in his own strength, he abandoned any attempt to trap Nathan and shifted instead to a support role. From Nathan's vantage point, the Byakugan revealed everything within a kilometer. Almost all of the root operatives were massing around Danzo. Satisfied with that, Nathan held his ground and waited. Minutes ticked by in silence, the air thick with anticipation. Then, Danzo appeared at the edge of the clearing, flanked by a dozen root ninja who fanned out to encircle Nathan. Standing within the barrier's silent glow, Nathan glanced up. This was the first time he'd faced Danzo since the Chunin exams. The spiky-haired leader looked older now, and his right arm, once unmarred, was entirely swathed in bandages, as though hiding some grievous wound. The sight was unexpectedly familiar. For a long moment, they simply regarded one another in tense quiet. Nathan thought back to the days when Danzo had been nothing more than a name in the village archives, a file to be studied. Now they stood face to face for only the second time, and the air between them crackled as if waiting for the storm to break. Nathan was a far cry from the boy he'd been 2 years earlier. Gone was the hesitancy, replaced by a quiet confidence and composure that radiated youthful heroism. His opponent stared at him for a long moment, taking in his changed posture, then let his gaze drift down, landing on Nathan's eyes. There they were, the 3-tomo Sharingan. Even this veteran of countless battles felt a physical weight settle on his chest, an oppressive force unlike anything he'd ever faced. At that instant, all his suspicions crystallized into certainty, and his blood ran hot with a dark desire. He yearned to tear those eyes from Nathan's head and claim their power for himself. Chapter 654, Head-On Confrontation. A cruel smile twisted Danzo's lips as he watched Nathan's greed flare. Sensing the perfect opportunity, Nathan swept up his arm and prepared to unleash his newest genjutsu, Illusion, Sharingan. But Danzo was no fool. The instant he detected Nathan's chakra spike, he snapped his eyes shut and pivoted on his heel. 2 root operatives sprang forward, turning their bodies into living shields to block both Nathan's gaze and any incoming assault. In that moment, Danzo was secure. "Now!" he barked. At his command, the encircling root ninjas surged forward in a coordinated strike. Poison-tipped kunai hissed through the air. Darts laced with paralyzing toxins whizzed toward Nathan's vital points. He reacted on instinct. The crimson glow of his Sharingan flickered against the pale outline of his Byakugan, and he blurred aside, dodging each lethal projectile as though he'd predicted its path. Then, with a flick of his wrist, Nathan sent a handful of shurikens spinning backward on his palm. They cut through the ranks of root agents attempting seals, forcing them to leap aside or risk a blade through the leg. Yet these operatives wore their loyalty like armor. They dodged only when necessary, never sacrificing their next jutsu for the sake of evasion. Undeterred, Nathan scanned for an opening. His Sharingan gleamed, mapping the enemy's chakra signatures. His Byakugan probed their blind spots. In that tense, rolling standoff, every heartbeat felt amplified, every breath, a countdown to the next exchange of death-dealing techniques. The first real blow was only moments away. That didn't guarantee they'd land a hit. Root operatives had already formed a tight ring around Nathan's target, ready to intercept any incoming strike. In that split second, he admired their unspoken coordination. Crack! A jagged bolt of lightning tore through the air. Nathan's Sharingan spun, calculating its arc, and he rolled aside just in time, the bolt scorching the ground where he'd stood. No sooner had he landed than the earth trembled beneath him. 2 armored palms burst from the soil and clamped around his ankle. "Earth release, underground trap," hissed the assailant. Nathan reacted instinctively, vaulting straight up to break free. But his leap left him momentarily suspended and exposed. Root ninjas seized the opportunity. Some hurled senbon and shuriken, others wove hand seals to unleash elemental jutsu, and a few charged in for lethal close-quarters strikes. Without hesitation, Nathan drew the long sword strapped to his back. In an instant, crackling arcs of electricity danced along its blade, and a blinding surge of blue-white light exploded outward. Every enemy in range staggered, their vision swimming with disorienting afterimages. This was his signature technique, lightning release, lightning sword. 10 days of relentless practice had brought Nathan's instant sword technique to level 6. He still hadn't unlocked the flawless 7th stage. His proficiency gauge stubbornly read 0, but the power he now wielded was already remarkable. As kunai and shuriken rained in his direction, Nathan slipped through them with fluid grace. A vibrant green aura flared around his body, and in an instant his speed spiked to its absolute limit. In the blink of an eye, he reappeared behind a root ninja, long sword slicing through empty air before cutting cleanly across the man's throat. Blood arced in a sudden spray, and the shinobi crumpled without a sound. Before the second operative could even draw breath, Nathan's form blurred next to him, blade poised for the killing blow, only to freeze as a ball of chakra-infused gas shot past like a bullet. Reflexively, he halted mid-stride. His irises had already shifted to a milky white, when he spotted Danzo concealed at the edge of the clearing. The elder shinobi's lips parted, preparing to unleash a second sphere of deadly gas. Nathan knew immediately who had launched that last assault, and recognized the jutsu at once, a B-rank wind-style technique, vacuum jade. He glanced from his attacker to the ring of root operatives closing in, then sheathed his long sword in one smooth motion. As Danzo hurled another volley of wind blades, Nathan sidestepped and formed a rapid series of hand seals. A soft green light sprang to life around him, weaving itself into a thin but surprisingly sturdy shirt of energy, chakra feather garb. The following vacuum missiles struck the garb's surface, leaving only faint ripples on its ethereal weave. At the same moment, other root ninjas, shaken free from their own illusory traps, began casting D and C-rank jutsu at him. Nathan ignored every loose burst of chakra. He only reacted when someone slipped past his defense and flung a kunai or shuriken in his direction, deflecting the tools effortlessly with a flick of his wrist. He made no attempt to counterattack. Instead, he wove through their formation, buying himself time. With the siege tightening, Nathan raised his hands again and slipped into another series of seals. His sudden focus on preparing a new technique put Danzo and the root operatives on high alert. In that charged stillness, both sides knew the next move could decide everything. Nathan watched impassively as some attackers lunged forward while others scrambled for cover. He had seen enough feeble attempts at resistance. Most of them were already doomed. With that thought solidifying his resolve, he wove the seals in a practiced blur. Then, with a low, resonant shout, he unleashed his ninjutsu. Thunder Release, Thunder Prison. In an instant, searing lightning detonated around him. Bolts of pure electricity fanned out from Nathan like writhing serpents, turning the air into a crackling storm. Every inch of space between him and his enemies seemed to vanish beneath the blinding glare. The thunderous roar of the jutsu pounded against eardrums, and before the first strike landed, static had already raised everyone's hair on end. "Scatter!" someone screamed, and a handful of root operatives bolted in every direction. It was already too late. The thunder prison expanded faster than any of them could react. Though a few shinobi who had anticipated Nathan's move managed to slip through the fringes, the rest were caught within the swirling cage of electricity. Trapped and helpless, they found themselves at the mercy of his devastating technique. Nathan had never revealed his signature technique in public before. Thunder Release, Thunder Prison. So neither Danzo nor his root operatives had any idea he possessed such overwhelming power. Caught entirely off guard, they paid the price. In shinobi warfare, information is just as deadly as any jutsu. A standard technique might inflict a few casualties, but a misstep against something like Thunder Prison means total annihilation. And that's exactly what happened here. Moments later, the roar of thunder and crackling lightning subsided, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. When the dust settled, more than a dozen charred bodies littered the clearing around Nathan. Some had tried to flee, others had scrambled for cover, but none survived. The shockwaves of energy had consumed them all. Not far beyond the blast zone, Danzo himself appeared, cloaked in calm authority. 4 root operatives emerged at his side, the only survivors of his scouting party. They slowed as they approached, eyes flicking from the smoldering corpses to the lone figure standing unscathed at the center. A tense silence fell. Nathan, breathing steadily, met Danzo's cold gaze. The battle's opening had ended decisively in his favor, but the true confrontation was only just beginning. Nathan surveyed the scene with an effortless smile. Of the 5 root operatives Danzo had assigned, 2 had been as sharp-eyed as their leader. The moment they sensed something was wrong, they activated the body flicker technique and slipped beyond the Thunder Prison's barrier. 2 more vanished into the earth itself, using an earth release escape jutsu to tunnel deep underground. Only one remained, or rather, only one had failed to escape in time and lay broken on her. He ground. Danzo's expression could not have been worse. He stared at the scattered bodies in bitter frustration. Even if they managed to eliminate Nathan here and now, he thought they'd be too weakened to swing the upcoming Hokage election in their favor. And that was far from his only concern. If future schemes required Root's support, there'd simply be no one left to carry them out. Root, after all, was nothing more than Konohagakure's secret Anbu training program. Sarutobi Hiruzen had quietly tolerated Danzo, swelling its ranks beyond official limits, but it remained a small, elite force. In preparation for this mission, Danzo had pulled nearly every available operative into play. Now, after 2 brutal waves of Nathan's assault, most of those men and women lay dead or grievously wounded, and the few survivors had fled. Danzo clenched his fists, anger and helplessness warring in his dark eyes. Losing so many lives and still facing a man like Nathan, the future looked bleaker than ever. Danzo's forces had been badly mauled. True, the root operatives could be pushed to unlock their potential and trained at lightning pace, but even that process took time. In the aftermath of so many losses, there simply weren't enough shinobi to plug the gaps. Danzo's scowl deepened. Only one solution remained: kill Nathan. If he failed at that, he would suffer an irreparable defeat. He turned to the 4 root agents standing at attention. "Go," he snapped. Without a moment's hesitation, the 4 dashed forward, disappearing like shadows as they raced toward Nathan's position. Chapter 655, 1 against 5. 4 shinobi barreled toward Nathan, with Danzo looming just behind them, ready to strike. Nathan's heart pounded, but he forced his voice to carry. "Now!" He swept his hand through the air, forming the seals for a powerful jutsu, and intoned, "Lightning release, thunder prison." Startled, the attackers skidded to a halt and leapt back, bracing for the crackling storm he'd just announced. In truth, Nathan hadn't intended to trap them. His chakra still rattled from the last explosion. It wasn't calm enough to sustain a true thunder prison. Instead, he used the classic feint. As they recoiled, he completed the seals for a different technique and shouted, "Lightning release, thunder snake." Through the gap in their defenses, a writhing coil of electrified energy shot forward, striking the nearest adversary in the chest. The man convulsed, rocked by jolts of lightning that seared across his armor. Before the others could recover their composure, Nathan unleashed another crackling serpent, then another. Each bolt struck true, sending shockwaves of pain through their ranks. By the time the last snake dissipated into flickers of blue-white light, 3 of the 5 shinobi lay incapacitated, smoking and twitching on the frozen ground. The 2 survivors froze in place, eyes wide, unwilling to close in. Nathan took a steadying breath. His makeshift deception had worked, buying just enough opening to thin their numbers. Now, with Danzo advancing at his back, the balance had shifted decisively in their favor. The forest air hummed with residual electricity, and for an instant, all was still. Then, with a curt nod from Danzo, they pressed the attack. Nathan didn't waste a second. The moment the 4 root jonin recovered and prepared to retaliate, the 2 lightning snakes he'd unleashed sprang forward in a flash of crackling energy. They homed in on the pair, whose chakra reserves were clearly lower than their comrades. The first jonin barely raised a hand to form a seal before unleashing a wind-release vacuum blade. A razor-sharp gale sliced one of the snakes cleanly in 2. The second jonin simply activated a clone substitution technique, sidestepping the other snake with casual ease. Meanwhile, the remaining 2 jonin moved in concert. One vanished beneath the earth to cast Earth Release, heart-cleaving technique, aiming to pierce Nathan's heart from below. The other drew a short sword and charged straight at him, intent on close-quarters combat. Nathan stood his ground. He didn't dodge. With a decisive motion, he drew his long sword from his belt and plunged the tip into the dirt. Lightning chakra surged outward in a brilliant arc, shattering the subterranean earth jutsu just as it threatened to strike. The ground trembled and cracked, forcing the underground jonin to reel back, his attack nullified before it could even form. Nathan drove his blade upward, intercepting the root jonin's short sword and carrying the arc of steel toward his throat. The jonin's face stayed impassive. He leaned back just enough to avoid the killing blow. Without missing a beat, Nathan pressed the attack, only to see through his Sharingan that the jonin had already twisted aside, eluding the second thrust. Swift as ever, Nathan unleashed his twin techniques, the illusionary sword, Mainkotsu, and the shadow sword, Kagekenjutsu. One slash fractured into 6, 3 solid blades weaving through 3 illusory afterimages, each sweeping in from a different angle. In the past, opponents might have blocked and dodged each phantom. This time, however, the jonin stood his ground. He recognized there was no safe path out of the assault, yet rather than flee, he lunged forward, sword aimed at Nathan, ready to trade blows if it meant buying his comrades a chance. Nathan's brow furrowed at the Jonin's unshakable resolve. Nathan had originally intended to pit himself against these opponents to sharpen his mastery of the shadow sword technique. Without any real battles lately, his training had stalled. Over the past month, he'd logged fewer than 3,000 proficiency points, and the gap between him and the perfected level 7 state still looked insurmountable. He'd hoped this skirmish would spur his progress. To his surprise, his foes practically invited an all-out fight. There was no time to waste. He needed a swift, decisive engagement. Through the corner of his eye, Nathan spotted another Root Jonin charging straight at him. Activating his Byakugan, he detected 2 more Root Jonin in the act of forming hand seals. Without hesitation, Nathan dropped back in a rapid retreat to split their focus. The Jonin ahead lunged after him, so Nathan unleashed a crackling bolt of concentrated chakra. Lightning style, lightning sword! The brilliant arc of electricity slammed into the pursuer, hurling him backward and searing a blackened scar across his chest. But Nathan's slight reprieve was fleeting. As the first Jonin struggled to regain his footing, the other 3 adversaries closed in, their attacks converging on him from all sides. Determined not to be overwhelmed, Nathan readied himself for the next wave. Seeing his opponent charging in, Nathan formed a hand seal in an instant and unleashed fire style, great fireball technique with a single hand. A roaring sphere of flame erupted, forcing the attacker to skid to a halt. But the other 2 assailants pressed their advantage immediately. One stamped his foot on the ground and invoked earth-style ninjutsu, sending tremors rolling through the earth and throwing Nathan's balance off. At the same moment, the third ninja wove a rapid series of seals, summoning wind-style ninjutsu. Spiraling columns of razor-sharp air, each as long as his outstretched arm, materialized before him and hurtled straight toward Nathan. Nathan grit his teeth, forcing himself to stay upright. With a smooth motion, he sheathed his long sword, raised his right hand in a final seal, and activated his chakra feather garment. A pale green aura flickered around him, coalescing into a flowing robe of shimmering feathers. Seconds later, the wind cone smashed into the barrier. Though the fabric rippled under the assault, not a shred of harm reached Nathan beneath it. Now protected, Nathan gathered his chakra reserves and prepared to turn the tide. He locked eyes with his foes, determination flashing in his gaze, and the battle truly began. Nathan didn't hesitate. First, he formed the hand seal for fire style, Phoenix fire technique, and exhaled a torrent of dense fireballs. The blazing orb streaked through the air, driving back the sword-wielding Jonin who'd been pressing the attack, and a Root Jonin who just recovered from Nathan's previous great fireball technique. Before they could regroup, Nathan's eyes flared. He reshaped his chakra and unleashed fire style, great dragon technique. From his mouth burst 3 colossal dragons of fire, each one roaring as it lunged toward his foes. The 2 Jonin leapt aside, their own ninjutsu fizzling out against the dragon's onslaught. Seizing the momentary lull, Nathan drew in a deep, steadying breath and poured every ounce of chakra into his next move. His fingers snapped into the water-style hand seal, and with a guttural shout he released explosive water wave. In an instant, a choking deluge poured from his mouth, coalescing into a titanic wave at least 10 meters high. The wall of water thundered forward like a landslide. Down below, 4 Root Jonin, including Danzo, who had been lurking in the canopy to observe and gather intelligence, were caught squarely in the blast. They were forced to abandon the forest floor, scrambling up the ancient trunks as the waves smashed into the undergrowth. In this world of Shinobi, the trees towered far above anything Nathan had ever seen, their branches high overhead becoming the only refuge from the raging torrent. Nathan's water-style, explosive water wave had been spectacular, but it hadn't swept all of his opponents away. No matter, he spotted Danzo and the others perched on the treetops across the riverbank. Without breaking stride, Nathan formed another hand seal and unleashed wind-style, Gale Blade. This time he sacrificed speed and stealth for sheer destructive force. A massive, whirling blade of wind carved through every tree along its path, sending trunks crashing into the river below. With their leafy perches destroyed, Danzo's team had no choice but to stand on the rippling water's surface. Nathan allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. He'd been waiting for this exact moment. He wove his fingers into a new seal, calling upon thunder release, lightning restraint. But he no longer relied on the original prison form. His mastery now let him shape and direct the lightning itself. Crack! Electric arcs danced over Nathan's body as crackling energy leapt down from his feet into the river. Water is a perfect conductor, and immediately the surface ignited with crackling blue light. Danzo and his men staggered back, eyes wide, as the electrified water surged around them, every ripple threatening to inflict a fatal shock. Nathan let the currents swirl outward, carving a circular moat of humming energy around his adversaries. He kept his stance low and balanced, ready to adjust the flow of lightning at a thought. Branches and debris bobbed dangerously close, adding to the chaos. Danzo struggled to steady himself, his expression a mix of fury and alarm. "Nowhere to run," Nathan said quietly, voice carrying over the crackle of the electrified river. He formed one final seal, preparing to end this confrontation once and for all. Between his wind blade, his explosive water wave, and the lightning restraint, his enemies were trapped in a perfect elemental trap, and Nathan intended to close it. In the blink of an eye, the water beneath Nathan erupted into a roiling sea of lightning. Danzo and the others, who had only just managed to plant their feet, stopped dead in their tracks at the dazzling display. Instinctively, they bolted for the nearest branches and trunks still protruding above the water, hoping the wood's natural insulation would spare them the worst of the shock. But Nathan wasn't about to give them that chance. Chapter 656, Continuous Killings. Nathan's eyes narrowed as the enemy advanced. He let out a low cry, and in an instant, a roaring surge of chakra exploded from his body. He channeled it inward, transforming the raw energy into crackling lightning chakra, then directed it down through his feet into the water at his feet. Immediately, the pool's surface erupted in electric arcs, the water itself humming with deadly power. Under Nathan's precise control, jagged bolts of lightning formed a tight perimeter around Danzo and the other Konoha operatives. No one could slip past this electric cage to reach the waterlogged branches and trunks they'd been sent to cut. Even if they tried to force their way through, the soaked wood would conduct the voltage, and Nathan had no intention of giving them that advantage. Trapped by the searing arcs, the 5 intruders recoiled, then scattered in disarray. Nathan allowed himself a quiet inward smile. Now's my chance. With practiced speed, he molded his chakra and formed the required hand seals. A powerful B-rank ninjutsu crackled to life around him. Water style, water dragon bullet technique. Water swirled at his feet, coalescing into the shape of a colossal, undulating dragon. In one swift motion, he thrust his palm forward. The water dragon roared to life as it shot toward the nearest root jonin, who was still struggling under the electric assault. The jonin's eyes widened in alarm, but it was too late. The massive dragon engulfed him, hammering him from all sides with a relentless crush of high-pressure water. The impact sent him skidding back, struggling to maintain his footing against the sheer force. As the jonin fought to recover, Nathan readied his next move. Lightning crackled in the air, and water rippled at his command. His control over the two elements would keep any opponent trapped between their lethal interplay. This was just the beginning. Nathan's extensive combat experience and lightning-fast reflexes let him narrowly evade the water dragon bullet. However, the lightning strike had briefly paralyzed his muscles. In that instant of weakness, a translucent blade of wind sliced through the air, impaling his neck and emerging on the other side in a spray of blood. The enemy ninja froze, hand instinctively rising to his throat, only to find his head severed, tumbling into the water with a heavy splash. Moments later, a 3-meter-high fountain of blood spouted from the wound. Nathan didn't pause to savor his victory. Satisfied that his wind blade was indeed lethal, he whirled toward another foe. With a single, forceful kick against the water's surface, he generated a powerful shockwave. The recoil shot him forward like a cannonball, ready for the next strike. As Nathan sprinted across the water's surface, he drew his longsword from its sheath at his hip and unleashed the instant sword technique. In an instant, he doubled his speed and appeared before the root jonin. Swish, his blade sliced the air. At the same moment, he wove together the illusion sword technique and the shadow sword technique, splitting himself into 3 real swordsmen and 3 illusory afterimages, all slashing at once. Outmatched and isolated, the Jonin refused to throw himself into a futile life-or-death clash. Fear had nothing to do with it. Danzo and the other 2 root Jonin were simply too far away to intervene. With no realistic hope of support, he fell back. Nathan's lips curled into a cold sneer. He planted his foot on the water's surface, vanished in a flash, and reappeared at the Jonin's flank. Swish! His long sword arced downward. The root Jonin snapped his short blade up to meet the blow, and their weapons rang together with a dull, metallic clang. Nathan made no attempt to force the bind. He simply held the clash, waiting for his opponent's next move. Nathan's longsword rang against the root Jonin's short blade, sparks flying at the point of impact. In that instant, Nathan slipped through the gap in his opponent's defense, reappearing behind him with uncanny speed. He swung, his sword again. This time, the root Jonin barely managed to scramble his guard and lift his weapon in time. But Nathan had already activated his secret technique, Thunder Release, Lightning Sword. A crackling arc of electricity erupted from his hand into the blade, bathing the pair of combatants in a blinding, electric blue glow. The lightning crackled along the edge of Nathan's sword and leapt across to the root Jonin's short sword upon contact. Instantly, a fierce current shot up the Jonin's arm, causing every muscle to seize. Realizing too late what had occurred, the root Jonin's grip faltered. He tasted the sting of electricity and, with a sharp cry, let go of his sword. The weapon clattered uselessly to the ground. Had he held on another moment, the surge would have ripped through him entirely. But now, disarmed and off balance, he was vulnerable. Without hesitation, Nathan closed the distance. His blade shimmered with leftover sparks of lightning as he advanced to finish the fight. Nathan shot out his left hand, a dense ball of chakra materializing in his palm. In an instant, he drove it into the root Jonin's midsection. A sickening crack echoed, and the Jonin doubled over, spitting blood, but he refused to back down. With fierce resolve, he clamped onto Nathan's wrist, determined to pin him in place. 2 more root agents were closing in, ready to exploit any hesitation. They believed that if they could hold Nathan even a moment longer, they'd have their opening. Yet they'd gravely underestimated him. Nathan's physique, already rated at 21 points and rising, granted him raw power far beyond that of a typical shinobi in an enhanced state. Coupled with his Sharingan, which revealed every subtle movement, he was unbeatable in close combat. As Nathan began to form a Rasengan, the Jonin tightened his grip, but Nathan simply twisted his arm, slipping free before any real force could be applied. The would-be ambush dissolved in an instant, leaving the Jonin clutching at empty air. Nathan twisted free from the assassin's grip in one smooth motion. Before his opponent could recover, he flipped a shuriken backward with deadly precision. The blade hissed through the air and sank into the man's throat. 2 down, 3 to go. Without pausing, Nathan sheathed his sword and wove a complex hand seal. Electricity crackled around him as he channeled chakra into his ninjutsu. Lightning Release. Thunder Snakes. With a thunderous boom, 2 crackling spheres of light coalesced in his palms before slithering forward as serpentine bolts of lightning. The 2 remaining attackers reacted in a heartbeat. They sidestepped the electric snakes, which vanished against the stone walls, and surged toward Nathan with kunai raised high, aiming squarely for his chest and abdomen. In an instant, his Sharingan awakened. The Scarlet Tomoe spun as he tracked every muscle twitch and blade trajectory. Anticipating their strike with uncanny clarity, Nathan slipped sideways, letting the kunai whistle harmlessly past him. Nathan didn't even flinch as the 2 assailants circled around him and struck again from both flanks. This time, he made no move to dodge. Instead, he raised a single hand, forming a precise seal, and then unleashed the Earth-style, hardening technique. In an instant, his flesh turned as solid as iron. The kunai the ninjas hurled at him pinged off his body with twin metallic dings, barely slowing their momentum. Without missing a beat, Nathan shifted his seals once more. He called upon the wind-style, wind-devouring. In the space of a heartbeat, countless razor-sharp gusts coalesced around him, swirling into a ferocious vortex. Trees, leaves, even loose stones were sucked into the Tempest's core, and so were the two root ninjas. Because Nathan had perfected this wind jutsu but rarely used it in actual combat, his opponents had no chakra channels keyed to its signature. They stood frozen for just long enough to be engulfed. The technique's destructive power rivaled even the fearsome lightning style, Thunder Prison, leaving nothing but utter silence and a fine mist of dust where the attackers had once stood. Both root jonin staggered under the impact, their bodies shredded as though cleaved by 1,000 blades. Blood spurted in every direction, painting the ground a crimson red. Even these seasoned operatives couldn't suppress their groans of agony, yet sheer grit and training kept them on their feet. With blades raised and eyes burning with resolve, they lunged at Nathan, intent on cutting him down while he was vulnerable. But Nathan was no easy target. His skin, recently tempered by his earth release hardening technique, had just reverted to its normal state, leaving him protected only by the lightweight chakra feather cloak draped over his shoulders. Spotting what looked like a sudden weakness, the two jonin charged in, certain they'd seized the perfect opening. Unfortunately for them, they'd overthought the situation and failed to see the hidden threat closing in. Chapter 657, The Final Battle. The kunai whipped toward Nathan in a deadly arc. Instantly, his 3 Magatama Sharingan flared and twisted into the Mangekyo Sharingan. He channeled that surge of power into his heaven control technique and vanished. 2 root jonin thrust their blades where he had been, only to find empty air. At the same moment, their own chakra flow severed his wind release, Galefang mid-spell, cutting the jutsu off at its source. Believing they were safe, the pair relaxed, until Nathan suddenly reappeared right behind one of them. "Watch out!" the other jonin yelled, but his warning came too late. The backlash from the halted wind jutsu struck the startled shinobi, scrambling his senses and crippling his reflexes. With ruthless precision, Nathan swung his sword and severed the man's head. The survivor roared and lunged forward, blades raised, determined to finish the job, but Nathan was already gone again, leaving him slashing at nothing but thin air. Nathan reappeared outside his opponent's line of sight, breathing a quiet sigh of relief. In that instant, his longsword arced through the air in a flash of silver light, and the second root jonin fell as silently as the first. Within moments, all 4 operatives lay defeated at Nathan's feet. Only the 4 shinobi maintaining the barrier remained beyond the clearing, along with Danzo. Nathan turned to face Danzo, his eyes burning with the black, sun-shaped tomoe of the Mangekyo Sharingan. All through the fight, Danzo had stood back, making no move, simply observing Nathan's battle and gathering data. Now that his remaining subordinates were out of commission, what would he do next? Meeting Nathan's gaze, Danzo betrayed no sorrow for his lost men and no trace of fear. Only a cold, unrestrained greed gleamed in his eyes. After a long, tense moment, he finally spoke, the first words he directed at Nathan since their encounter. "You've really awakened the Mangekyo Sharingan," Danzo said, his voice low and controlled. "When did it happen?" Nathan said nothing, letting the question hang in the air. Danzo hardly spared him a glance as he pressed on. "That sudden vanishing and reappearing just now, it was one of your Sharingan techniques, wasn't it? No wonder so many fell before me. Now tell me, where's the other eye?" Nathan's brow furrowed. He hadn't expected Danzo to know so much about the Mangekyo Sharingan, least of all that it manifests 2 distinct abilities. Still, he reminded himself, once someone grows suspicious and begins digging, they'll unearth something. The Mangekyo Sharingan may be rare, but it certainly isn't a legend. The Shimura clan might not boast the ancient prestige of the Uchiha or Senju during the Warring States era, but it remains one of Konoha's most respected houses. With Root's intelligence network probing every corner of the village, uncovering fragments of knowledge on the Mangekyo was only a matter of time, and the fact that Danzo still lingered here? All the more proof he hadn't yet grasped the true extent of the Mangekyo Sharingan's power. Had Danzo really witnessed Nathan wielding the Mangekyo Sharingan so effortlessly, he might have fled on the spot. But Nathan took comfort in the fact that his opponent stayed firmly in place. Without a second thought, Nathan activated his Heaven's Control, erased his chakra signature, and lunged straight at Danzo. Danzo, however, showed no surprise. The moment Nathan vanished, he raised a hand, wove swift seals, and intoned, "Wind release, vacuum shockwave." From his mouth burst a razor-sharp blast of compressed air, whipping through the air like scythes and weasels, cutting a full 360 degrees around him, his glares fixed especially on the space behind. Still, Nathan did not reappear. His mastery of heaven's control had come a long way since he first unlocked the Mangekyo Sharingan. What once lasted no more than 10 seconds now stretched past 40. A few seconds lag meant nothing. Frustration flickered across Danzo's face as he stood alone amid the roaring wind blades, waiting. Danzo's ninjutsu dissipated, he vaulted backward without hesitation, only to find Nathan already at his heels. In a single, fluid motion, Nathan's long blade slashed toward Danzo's neck. But Danzo had been ready for exactly that. He lunged forward just in time, the air whistling where the sword should have met flesh. Before Nathan could regroup, Danzo spun on his heel and launched a handful of shuriken from his backhand, aiming straight for Nathan's vital areas. The metal darts gleamed under the moonlight, but Nathan barely batted an eyelid. With a silent invocation of his heaven control ability, he vanished from sight. When Nathan reappeared, he was already at Danzo's right side, blade arcing for the carotid. Danzo only sneered. In the next heartbeat, ebony-black seals blossomed across Nathan's arms and legs, ribbon-like markings that tightened instantly, pinning him in place and freezing his strike mid-swing. Nathan recognized the self-reprisal curse seal the instant Danzo spoke its name. The smirk on Danzo's face vanished in an instant. He looked genuinely puzzled that Nathan would know such a technique. Yet Danzo hardly seemed the type to question his opponent's knowledge. When Nathan remained perfectly still, Danzo drew the short sword at his waist and lunged, aiming for Nathan's throat. Just as Nathan had anticipated, no opportunity for banter appeared. With a silent regret, he gathered his energy and activated heaven's control. The self-reprisal curse seal shattered in a burst of light, and Nathan's form vanished before Danzo's eyes. Had Danzo paused to demand how Nathan recognized the seal, Nathan could easily have freed himself and turned the blade back on his attacker. But Danzo never asked. Nathan allowed himself a moment's disappointment, though he immediately reminded himself that an experienced veteran like Danzo wouldn't make such a basic error unless he had his own reasons. Nathan noted with quiet satisfaction that Danzo no longer had 10 Sharingan to spare. Every second now worked against the old shinobi. "What a pity," he murmured, stepping into view a short distance away. He had no intention of opening with the heaven technique, even though its power was tempting. Yes, it would force Danzo onto the defensive, but those powerful ocular jutsu came at a terrible price. Danzo's eyes were only Mangekyo Sharingan, not the eternal form, and repeated activations risked permanent blindness. Against a run-of-the-mill ninja, Nathan could afford the cost. He'd finish them before their eyes gave out. But this was Danzo, a veteran whose speed and skill approached the Sasuke Nathan remembered. In raw strength, he might not have matched that legend perfectly, but he still towered above the typical jonin, and his battlefield experience was in a league of its own. Wasting the heaven technique now would be extravagantly reckless. Still, Nathan felt no fear. Even without his most devastating ocular jutsu, he was more than confident he could defeat Danzo. Fueled by determination, Nathan unleashed the instant sword technique, his form dissolving into a shadow as he surged toward his opponent. Chapter 658, Fear. Nathan charged straight at Danzo, but the older shinobi made no attempt at politeness. In one fluid motion, Danzo's hands formed a series of seals. He drew 2 steel shuriken from his sleeve, infused wind nature chakra into one of them, and sent both spinning through the air. Even at a distance, Nathan felt the razor edge of those blades, enough to cut gold and break jade, as the saying goes. Rather than attempt to block, Nathan slipped his body aside the moment Danzo released them, letting the projectiles slice past him before pressing his assault. But barely 2 strides later, his expression shifted. With the Byakugan's full 360-degree vision, he watched in alarm as those same shuriken curved back through the air like returning boomerangs, and then one of them struck him squarely in the back. Pressing his hand against the blade's flat, Nathan traced the swirl of Danzo's wind chakra signature. In that instant, he unraveled the secret behind the technique. a hidden wind escape, nimble enough to hunt its target even after the initial throw. Nathan noted immediately how his opponent had studied the transformation and nature of wind-release chakra to its very core, producing some astonishing innovations in wind-based ninjutsu. A sardonic thought crossed his mind. With such complete mastery of wind release, why not aim to become Kazekage instead of dreaming about Hokage? Of course, he was only teasing himself. No Hokage in history was celebrated for wind techniques alone. Even Hiruzen Sarutobi, the third Hokage, relied on a broad arsenal of jutsu. As these musings flickered through his mind, Nathan pivoted on his heel. With a single, fluid motion, he swung his long sword in a sweeping arc and struck precisely at the centers of gravity on two incoming shurikens. A sharp ding-ding rang out as steel sheared steel, sending the blades skittering harmlessly aside. But Danzo had anticipated that counterattack. The moment Nathan turned, Danzo appeared behind him in an instant, a foot-long dagger leveled at Nathan's back. Nathan barely had time to register its approach. Traces of wind-released chakra glinted along the dagger's edge before it was too late. This wasn't just any ninjutsu. It was the one Nathan had mastered long ago, Wind Escape, Vacuum Blade. But whereas Nathan typically channels the chakra into a small gust to sharpen his blade's edge, Danzo had wrapped the whirlwind chakra around the entire sword. The result was a strike both blindingly fast and devastatingly penetrating. Nathan barely had time to react before the blade drove forward. With no chance to formulate a counter-jutsu, he leapt back and twisted aside, narrowly evading the thrust. Yet Danzo, sensing his advantage, didn't relent. The moment Nathan landed, Danzo surged forward again, his sword slashing toward Nathan's throat with ruthless precision. A cold rush of fear skated across Nathan's skin as he felt the steel's promise of death. Without hesitation, he pivoted and sprang back, widening the gap between them. Still, Danzo pressed on. He closed the distance and unleashed a third strike, but the blow lacked the speed and power of the first two. The chakra that had fueled his assault was beginning to ebb, and with it, the ferocity of his follow-through. Nathan didn't wait for the third strike. He shifted his weight, angled his blade upward, and cut across Danzo's dagger. Ding! A bright ring of steel echoed as long sword met short, both weapons locked in midair, quivering under the pressure. For a heartbeat, the two men struggled, metal grinding against metal, sparks flaring at the contact point. Then Nathan let out a fierce cry, unleashing the chakra coursing through his veins. His arm muscles bulged, and in that instant his strength surged. He drove forward, forcing Danzo's dagger back, and with a powerful arc, slashed at his opponent's flank. Danzo's eyes widened at the sudden force. He bent his knees to absorb the blow, then sprang backward, using the momentum to retreat. Bang, 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 his boots slapped the water's surface in rapid succession, sending up plumes of spray. Each step left a rippling puddle in his wake, but even that didn't slow his flight. Nathan watched him skid away across the pond, every muscle tensed and ready for whatever came next. Nathan sprang forward without hesitation, lifting his foot and slashing his blade in one fluid motion. Despite being caught off guard, Danzo's reflexes held firm. He may have been at a disadvantage, but years of life-or-death battles had honed his instincts to a razor's edge. He parried Nathan's opening onslaught, steel striking steel with echoing clangs. But Nathan was relentless. Like a well-oiled machine, he flowed through a dazzling array of sword techniques, each cut more precise than the last. Danzo found himself driven steadily backward, unable to find solid footing as the clangs of their blades rang out in the courtyard. And then, in a single perfect moment, Nathan's blade slipped past Danzo's guard, slicing across his forearm. The wound was shallow, far from mortal, and Danzo, hardened by countless conflicts, felt only a sting. Yet the cut carried weight beyond its depth. It was a clear declaration. Danzo had been outmatched. Danzo paused, gaze fixed on the blood trickling down his arm. He was nothing if not decisive. Recognizing that further resistance would only prolong the outcome, he lowered his sword. Without a word, he stepped back and conceded the duel. In the ringing silence that followed, Nathan stood victorious, his supremacy in the art of the sword indisputably proven. Danzo skidded backward, launching himself into a series of swift leaps to widen the gap between them. Terror flashed in his eyes as he stared at Nathan. Awakening the Mangekyo Sharingan was one thing. After all, it flowed from the proud Uchiha bloodline, but to master swordsmanship at such a young age, to have already amassed genuine battlefield experience, that spoke of raw, terrifying talent, something Danzo feared above all else. Nathan gave no quarter. The instant Danzo put some distance between them, Nathan closed it with a single fluid step. Before Danzo's startled eyes, Nathan's chakra arteries flared to life as he activated his Byakugan, the world sharpening around him in white-hot detail. Caught off guard, Danzo's hand flashed into a seal. In the next instant, the hidden seal over his right eye shattered, and Nathan, through his Byakugan's enhanced vision, saw the truth. The placid blank where chakra should have been now throbbed with the telltale swirl of a Sharingan. Of course, Danzo had concealed his eye just as Nathan concealed his own Byakugan. Nathan's lips twitched in a half-smile. Surprise might have worked on lesser opponents, but not on him. Now that both their trump cards were in play, only raw skill and willpower would decide the victor. Danzo probably hid that eye because he feared someone, most of all the Uchiha clan, finding out he'd implanted a Sharingan. During the war, Kakashi was relentlessly hunted by Uchiha after he inherited Obito's eye. If Minato Namikaze hadn't stepped in, Kakashi would have lost it. Now that the fighting has ended, the Uchiha would go berserk if they learned Danzo was doing the same thing. His history with the clan is fraught with resentment, even outright enmity. No matter how much power he wields, he can't afford to provoke an entire bloodline. Better to keep his stolen eye hidden. Yet, faced with the unfolding crisis, Danzo took the risk and revealed his Sharingan. Was it reckless, though, to flaunt it before a true Uchiha, one who had awakened the Mangekyo Sharingan? Nathan could only stare in bewilderment. Chapter 659, Reasonable Speculation. Danzo barely registered Nathan's steady gaze as he peeled away the bandage hiding his right eye. In one swift motion, he flung it aside and opened his lid to reveal the three-tomo Sharingan. Immediately, the world snapped into razor-sharp focus. Every movement around him slowed to a crawl. He shut his eye again for an instant, savoring the rush of power. When he reopened it, however, Nathan's face was unreadable. No shock, no wonder, not even a hint of surprise. Danzo frowned. At Nathan's age, no more than 12 or 13, a boy should at least startle or shout. Yet the boy stood completely calm. A troubling thought crossed Danzo's mind. Had Nathan somehow known about the transplanted Sharingan already? He shook his head in denial. He'd sealed the eye so deeply that detection seemed impossible, and yet Nathan's impassivity suggested otherwise. Danzo fell silent, puzzled by the boy's uncanny composure and determined to uncover the truth behind it. Not even a handful of Nathan's own subordinates knew the truth. There was simply no way he could have anticipated Danzo's tactics unless he'd somehow tapped into an unknown source of information. Precognition? Danzo's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto Nathan's. He'd already witnessed one of the opponent's Mangekyo Sharingan abilities, the space-time teleportation jutsu, and now he'd caught a glimpse of the other eye's power for the first time. It made no sense for someone to rely on only one ocular jutsu, yet Nathan had consistently outmaneuvered every attack. Think of the time he slipped through a ring of root agents unscathed, or how he dodged the second-stage assault of that wind-release shuriken before it even reached him. Did this boy truly possess the ability to see the future? Danzo's brow furrowed as he mulled it over. Across from him, Nathan remained entirely oblivious to his mentor's train of thought, though if he knew, he'd surely be impressed. After all, without any concrete proof, Danzo's leap to precognition was remarkably insightful, even if it turned out to be mistaken. Nathan pieced together the most plausible theory from the scant clues. With the memories of his past life sharpening his instincts, he almost felt prophetic. Danzo had uncovered a fragment of the truth, but Nathan refused to dwell on that revelation. He wouldn't give his opponent a moment to adapt to the Sharingan. No sooner had the seal dissolved than Nathan activated his instant sword technique. In a flash of light, he became an afterimage, hurtling toward Danzo at impossible speed. Danzo, however, was no slouch. Empowered by the Sharingan, he tracked Nathan's blur with uncanny precision. Without missing a beat, he wove a new hand seal and unleashed the same ninjutsu he'd used moments before, wind release, shuriken. Dozens of razor-edged shuriken, each infused with wind chakra, shot outward like deadly boomerangs. They sliced through the air in perfect formation, an inescapable storm of steel. Thanks to the Sharingan's guidance, Danzo's control was exquisite. Every blade seemed to anticipate Nathan's move, threatening to cut him down before he could close the distance. Danzo's Byakugan granted him a full 360-degree field of vision. Every feint, every shuriken Nathan sent his way was instantly seen and accounted for. But Nathan didn't hesitate. In the blink of an eye, he traced a Z-shaped arc across the surface of the nearby stream, the blade's edge skimming the water so fast it sprayed up like mist. With that lightning-quick maneuver, he evaded all of Danzo's thrown shuriken and closed the distance between them in an instant. Nathan's long sword lashed out like a streak of silver lightning. Reacting equally fast, Danzo activated his Sharingan. The crimson eye whirled, locking onto the blade's trajectory. With a twist of his wrist, Danzo caught the tip of Nathan's sword, then, drawing a dagger from his belt, he pressed the short blade against Nathan's weapon. Sparks flew as sword met dagger. Yet Nathan's expression never wavered. In a flash, he vanished, edged to Danzo's side, and swung his sword again. Clang! Danzo met the blow head-on, using his dagger and sword crossguard to deflect the strike. Their weapons clashed so fiercely that onlookers might have mistaken the metallic ring for temple bells. They fought in a deadly dance of steel. At the first impact, their blades slipped and rattled against each other, dislodging shinobi tools from their scabbards. Without missing a beat, Nathan adjusted his grip, shifted his footwork, and drove his sword in another arc. Danzo's blade and dagger snapped up in defense, deflecting the blow once more. Again, that sharp, ringing clash. Back and forth it went, strike, parry, hold, evade. Nathan unleashed every technique he knew, flowing from one sword form to the next, as if he were a ghost haunting Danzo from every angle. He spun behind his opponent, lunged to the side, then hopped forward for a downward slash. But despite his relentless barrage, Danzo's combined Byakugan and Sharingan skills let him anticipate and counter nearly every move. Breathing hard, Nathan circled, gathering himself for another series of attacks. Sparks had stopped flying now, but the tension between them crackled in the air like static. Neither man would yield, but for the moment, Nathan's ghostly onslaught had yet to break Danzo's iron defense. Nathan's strike was fierce enough to unsettle Danzo, but the veteran shinobi, relying on both his storied battle experience and the power of his Sharingan, managed to barely deflect the blow. The clash sapped some of Nathan's strength and dulled the edge of his assault, yet in the process, he'd sharpened his mastery of the Shadow Sword technique and the Thunder Release, Thunder Light Sword. Sensing his moment, Nathan drew back and stepped away, ready to deliver the final blow. Danzo hovered above the water's surface, chest heaving, and made no move to follow. Their last exchange had shown him Nathan's true prowess, and a reckless pursuit now would be nothing short of suicide. He watched as Nathan's robes remained virtually unscathed, the younger man's face set with quiet resolve. In that instant, Danzo admitted to himself that he'd miscalculated. Nathan's power far outstripped what any jonin should possess. At that moment, even if Danzo had wanted to retreat first, Nathan wouldn't have let him. No sooner had Danzo pulled back than Nathan sheathed his sword, formed a hand seal, and unleashed his fastest jutsu, water style, great exploding water wave. In an instant, a dense sphere of water materialized and swelled rapidly, poised to engulf Danzo. Once that wave struck, Nathan planned to follow up immediately with lightning style, lightning prison, and finish the fight in one swift strike. But Danzo had been watching his every move. The moment Nathan completed the seal, Danzo sensed the impending danger, and without a second's hesitation, leapt clear of the blast zone. Nathan's water style relied on sheer force to overwhelm an opponent. As long as Danzo remained within range, there was no way out. In truth, Nathan's newly upgraded Great Exploding Water Wave was still beyond his complete mastery, and he couldn't yet expand it to its full potential in the blink of an eye. Danzo barely had time to catch his breath. If that moment slipped away, he'd be overwhelmed. Clenching his teeth, he bit down on his thumb and let a drop of blood fall onto his palm. In one swift motion, he wove the hand seals of a summoning jutsu. A plume of chakra-charged smoke spiraled outward, and when it cleared, a massive creature stood between him and Nathan. Its head resembled a cow's, Its feet were striped like a tiger's, and its sleek, fire-orange hide rippled with power. A long, thin tail lashed behind it, and from its face extended an elephant's trunk. This was Danzo's contracted summon, the Dream Tapir. The instant the tapir laid eyes on Nathan's enormous water sphere, it lunged forward without hesitation. It gaped wide, activated its unique swallowing technique, and sucked the entire sphere into its cavernous belly. For a heartbeat, the water jutsu's growth stalled. Nathan, however, didn't flinch. He channeled more chakra into his core and pushed it outward, directly into the water the tapir had just ingested. The sphere began to swell again inside the creature's stomach, stretching its flesh taut. The dream tapir shuddered, panic flickering in its wide eyes as the unstoppable pressure built within. Nathan sized up his opponent. Only someone truly formidable or hopelessly foolish would refuse to back down, and he knew he fell squarely into the former category. The summoned creature's fierce glare meant little. The very fact he'd been called forth by Danzo made the situation clear. Danzo never summoned him lightly, only in the toughest battles. This adversary was no pushover, but at least it wasn't human. Just then, Danzo's voice cut through the air. "Assist me." Nathan snapped his fingers into the requisite hand seals, inhaled deeply until his chest swelled, and drawing on the nightmare tapir's potent energy, unleashed his ninjutsu. Wind Release, Vacuum Wave. Chapter 660. Mistake. Danzo was already a master of wind. Release, Vacuum Wave. Now, bolstered by the Dream Tapir's blessing, his technique had grown exponentially more powerful. What had once been a mid-range jutsu he could only use up close, now transformed into a true long-distance assault. As he channeled chakra, a torrential gust of air roared from his lungs, instantly coalescing into a sickle-shaped blade of wind dozens of meters long. In a single fluid motion, the wind blade lunged forward and cleaved into Nathan's giant water sphere, slicing cleanly through its surface before bursting through its defenses. The sound of rupturing water rippled through the air. Nathan's water release. Great explosive water wave fractured at the impact, and the contained water erupted outward in a blinding spray. Realizing he could no longer hold the formation, Nathan cut off his chakra and guided the surging torrent toward Danzo. The force behind that water flow, if it struck, would have torn flesh from bone. But Danzo was gone. In the blink of an eye, he vanished, leaving only the muddy crater where Nathan's redirected blast slammed into the ground, sending shards of earth and droplets of water flying in every direction. Nathan watched as Danzo's chakra flared from the powerful ninjutsu he'd just unleashed. The sudden surge left him no time to dodge, but the dream tapir at Danzo's side wasn't snacking on kibble. As the torrent of water rushed forward, the beast silently activated its swallowing ability, drawing every drop into its cavernous maw. Nathan frowned. The tapir hadn't been touched at all. A flash of insight struck him. This was exactly the tactic Sasuke had used against similar foes. Nathan relaxed his grip on the water ball, allowing its energy to disperse into the surrounding air. Then, seizing his chance, he formed a series of hand seals and unleashed a roaring inferno. Fire style, great dragon fire technique. In an instant, 3 colossal fire dragons stormed into being, twisting and writhing under Nathan's command as they lunged at the dream tapir. The creature's swallowing ability had all the appearance of an overwhelming force, but in truth it was merely a manifestation of wind-style chakra. And among the 5 elemental affinities, fire is the natural counter to wind. The dragons closed in, their scorching maws ready to turn the wind beast's defenses to ash. Nathan decided that only a fire-style ninjutsu could stop this monstrous beast. He drew in a deep breath and began to shape chakra for his signature technique, the Great Dragon Fire style. Yet to his astonishment, the dream tapir didn't react the way it had when facing Sasuke. Instead of biting down and swallowing the roaring fire dragon whole, the tapir hesitated at the last moment, denying Nathan's blaze any opening into its body. Before the fire could strike, the dream tapir thrust out its trunk and unleashed a ferocious gust of wind, laced with potent wind-style chakra. The blazing dragon froze, buffeted by the tornado force blast. Within heartbeats, the beastly gale tore the fire dragon apart and scattered its embers across the clearing. But the assault wasn't finished. As every shinobi knows, fire thrives on wind. The drifting embers caught in the taper's residual vortex ignited once more, coalescing into a towering wave of flame. In an instant, the inferno roared back toward Nathan, intent on engulfing him in its wrath. Nathan had clearly miscalculated. He'd only intended to learn from another's success, take a shortcut to mastery, but he never expected Mengmo to be in a different condition facing him than he was facing Sasuke. In the end, Nathan not only failed to steal the chicken, but also lost more than a handful of rice. The lesson was harsh but invaluable. He could no longer trust the memories stored in his mind. And now that very mistake threatened his life. A towering wave of fire roared toward him. Without a moment's hesitation, Nathan formed a hand seal and called out, "Water-style water wall." In an instant, a wall of water erupted on the ground, roaring up to meet the inferno. The flames hissed and sputtered against the wet barrier and fizzled into harmless steam. But before Nathan could steady himself, another threat emerged. Danzo had used the distraction to calm and redistribute his chakra. Masking his preparations behind the roar of steam, he molded a fresh hand seal and unleashed his next attack. Wind style, vacuum jade. Nathan's eyes widened. He knew even a single razor-sharp wind blade could cut through flesh and bone. As the vacuum-charged jade blades hurtled toward him, he braced for impact, ready to test the true limits of his water wall. Nathan's chest tightened as Danzo and his dream taper companion opened fire. Puff, 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 the air exploded around him with a relentless hail of vacuum rounds, each shot crisper and deadlier than the last. Ordinarily, Nathan's water barrier could shrug off a storm of such bullets, but the dream tapir's blessing had transformed them. What had once been mere pistol blasts now tore through the water shield like high-velocity sniper fire, cleaving straight through without losing an ounce of force. Worse still, Danzo's Sharingan guided every shot with uncanny precision, forcing Nathan to twitch, dodge, and weave just to stay in the stream. He could feel the rush of wind as each round screamed past. "This is trouble," he muttered, eyes flicking across the incoming barrage. Summoning every ounce of focus, Nathan activated his left eye technique, Tianjiyu, the heavenly wisdom charm. In an instant, his form shimmered from view, vanishing into the ether. The final vacuum round passed harmlessly through the space he had occupied, and the elemental currents of Danzo's ninjutsu fizzled out. Moments later, Nathan reappeared behind Danzo, the air humming with displaced chakra. The sudden shift in momentum left Danzo off balance, and for the first time in this duel, Nathan seized the initiative. Nathan didn't hesitate. As Danzo intoned the final syllables of his technique, 6-9 scroll seal, Nathan activated the power of the Heaven's Emperor and vanished from the incoming attack. It wasn't that he couldn't dodge conventionally. His Manjikyo Sharingan granted him uncanny perception, but he judged that if he simply kept evading, Danzo would relentlessly press the assault, never letting up. Nathan refused to be slow-rolled into a defensive stalemate. By summoning Heaven's Emperor, he shattered Danzo's attack rhythm in an instant, covering his earlier missteps and creating the opening he needed. In a flash of crimson light, Nathan reappeared behind his opponent, perfectly positioned to strike back. Not far away, the massive nightmare tapir lumbered into view, Danzo's latest guardian beast. Seizing Danzo's momentary distraction, Nathan raised his right hand. He concentrated chakra in his palm until it coalesced into a razor-sharp shuriken. The air around it hummed as it sliced toward its target. Nathan held the enormous chakra-infused shuriken in the center of his palm. The blade began to spin, slicing through the air so ferociously that it tore open a vortex of wind. The roar of rushing air swept across the battlefield, and even the nightmare tapir, an opponent of immense bulk, shuddered at the sheer force of it. Standing nearby, Danzo's eyes went wide the moment he recognized the technique. Wind style, rising shuriken. The intelligence reports had claimed Nathan could wield it repeatedly, but seeing it in person left Danzo pale. Without a second's hesitation, he barked, "Get out of the way!" Surprisingly nimble for its size, the nightmare tapir sprang aside. Nathan's Manjikyo Sharingan spun in his eyes as he locked onto the beast's new position. With a confident flick of his wrist, he launched the wind-style rising shuriken. It screamed through the air like a whistling arrow, streaking toward the target, only to slam into empty space. Moments later, a gout of wind-style chakra erupted from the tapir's nostrils, revealing the real beast's true location. Nathan's shuriken had struck nothing but an afterimage, while the real nightmare tapir readied its next move under the cover of its chakra cloak. The creature suddenly surged forward, its speed spiking so abruptly that it slipped past Nathan's attack by a hair's breadth. A deafening blast echoed through the clearing. Nathan knitted his brow as he watched the dust settle, and after a beat he murmured, "Just as I feared, if you can't control it perfectly, something's always missing." If only his wind style, Razin Shuriken technique were at level 10, granting him the ability to steer the attack in mid-flight, no foe would ever escape that final strike. But in real combat, there is no room for what if.